Imagine you're a hyper-educated avant-gardist in grad school learning to write.
Right.
Screen gets all fuzzy now as the viewer is invited to imagine this. Coming out of an avant-garde tradition, I get to this grad school, and the grad school turns out all the teachers are realists. They're not at all interested in postmodern avant-garde stuff. Now, there's an interesting delusion going on here. So they don't like my stuff. I believe that it's not because my stuff isn't good, but because they just don't happen to like this kind of aesthetic. In fact, known to them but unknown to me, the stuff was bad. It was indeed bad. So in the middle of all this, hating the teachers, but hating them for exactly the wrong reason, this was spring of 1986. I remember who I went to see the movie with. Blue Velvet comes out. Blue Velvet comes out. Blue Velvet is a type of surrealism. It may have debts. There's a debt to Hitchcock somewhere, but it is an entirely new and original kind of surrealism. It no more comes out of a previous tradition or the postmodern. It is completely David Lynch. And I don't know how well you or your viewers would remember the film, but there are some very odd. There's a moment when a guy named the Yellow Man is shot in an apartment, and then Jeffrey, the main character, runs to the apartment, and the guy's dead, but he's still standing there. There's no explanation, you know? He's just standing there. And it's almost classically French, Franco-philistically surreal. And yet it seems absolutely true and absolutely appropriate. And there was this, I know I'm taking a long time to answer your question, there was this way in which I all of a sudden realized that the point of being postmodern or being avant-garde or whatever wasn't to follow in a certain kind of tradition, that all that stuff is BS imposed by critics and can't followers afterwards, that what the really great artists do, and it sounds very trite to say it out loud, but what the really great artists do is they're entirely themselves. They're entirely themselves, they've got their own vision, their own way of fracturing reality, and then if it's authentic and true, you will feel it in your nerve endings.
Jag vill ha vetskap.
Du vill ha garanti.
Kalla det vad du vill. Är det så grymt otänkbart att fatta Gud med sina sinnen? Varför ska han gömma sig i en dunstkrets av halvuttalade löften och osedda under? Hur ska vi kunna tro på de troende när vi inte tror själva? Vad blir det av oss som vill tro men inte kan? Och vad blir det av dem som varken vill eller kan tro? Varför kan jag inte döda Gud inom mig? Varför lever han vidare inom mig på ett smärtsamt och förebyggande sätt, trots att jag förbannar honom och vill vräka ut honom ur mitt hjärta? Varför är han trots allt en jäckande verklighet som jag inte kan bli kvitt? Hör du mig?
Jag hör dig.
Jag vill ha vetskap. Inte tro, inte antaganden, utan vetskap. Jag vill att Gud räcker mig sin hand, avtäcker sitt ansikte och talar till mig.
Men han tiger.
Wittgenstein believed that the most serious and profound problems and questions and issues could be discussed only in the form of jokes. I mean, I know in U.S. lit, there's a tradition from about the 50s and 60s called black humor, which is a very kind of sardonic, sad type of humor. I'm grasping for something interesting to say in response. I think probably sometimes it can be, and sometimes it isn't. There are forms of humor that offer escapes from pain, and there are forms of humor that transfigure pain. You know what would help me? Tell me what you think. Like, if we do this as a conversation, it will be easier for me.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not often all that aware of stuff that's really funny in the book. In the American version of Infinite Jest, I set out to write a sad book. And when people liked it and told me that the thing they liked about it was that it was so funny, it was just very surprising. It's the other strange thing about humor. I teach school and I teach literature, and some of what I teach is Kafka, and there's a story about Kafka that in some of Kafka's most horrific stories, his neighbors would complain because he would be laughing so hard late at night as he wrote these stories. He found them very, very funny. And there are things in them that are funny, but I don't know that many people would understand laughing so hard that your neighbors would complain. The book is so long, though, it took so long to write, that it's almost hard to remember the impulses at the beginning because everything sort of changes. I mean, it's something you live with for years and years rather than something that you just have an idea or a feeling and you just do. The root in English of addict is the Latin addicere, which means religious devotion. It was an attribute of beginning monks, I think. There's an element in the book in which various people are living out something that I think is true, which is that we all worship, and we all have a religious impulse. We can choose to an extent what we worship, but the myth that we worship nothing and give ourselves away to nothing is simply sets us up to give ourselves away to something different. For instance, pleasure, or drugs, or the idea of having a lot of money and being able to buy nice stuff. Or in the tennis academy, it's somewhat different. It's devotion to an athletic pursuit that requires a certain amount of sacrifice and discipline, but is nevertheless an individual sport, and one is trying to get ahead as an individual. I doubt this makes very much sense.
Oh, there.
Oh, am I? Oh, God, sorry. Shit, I was halfway lucid for a second there, too. And it probably didn't come through?
That was fine.
I was feeling lucid.
I promise it was fine. Yeah, I went out for just the last question very well. But it's kind of hard because he moves in and out.
Yeah, okay.
It's,
I move in and out?
oh, yeah.
You know, the thing is, the background is not too pretty, of course, and that's why we're not showing.
I'm sorry.
No, that's cool.
That's okay.
No, because you're pontificating.
Hey, thank you.
You have to.
There's a
In
nice
very
word.
deep,
Thank you.
spiritual way. Okay, which is completely screwing me. Kidding. That's it. I'm kidding. So you are. You're, I can tell you're very.
Twitchy. I'm sorry?
You're very reflective.
Well, these are hard questions. Particularly when it's about something you did like 7 years ago.
Okay. I just shoot for pictures.
Yeah. I would trade places with you at this moment.
Anytime.
In terms of what can be done about the dilemma, first of all, I'm wondering who would care what I think, and second, I'm not sure, and third, what do you think?
In Germany, we have this TV literary expert, and he called him the literary pope. So he's the pope of literature. And people think he has a very good niveau of everything, and he really knows when he says the book is good, the book is good.
Who is this guy?
His name is Marcel Reich-Ranitzky. Maybe you heard of him. And he's a very funny guy, and he's maybe 80 years old or something. And he has always this verdict on the book, so the book is shit.
He's part of your show? He's part of...
No. But he is just a figure in German culture. But at the same time, he always wants, what he doesn't want a book to be is boring. No, by no means boring. And at the same time, he really understands a lot about books, and he's really a good reader. But by saying all the time, well, things are not supposed to be boring, and I mean, I think that's really a mistake, and it's taken for granted. And I feel sometimes I also have this feeling that I don't want to be bored, but at the other side, I see that it's not the option. I mean, I don't know if it's not right. I somehow have this feeling, even if it sounds stupid.
When you walk into most public spaces in America, it isn't quiet anymore. They pipe music through. And the music's easy to make fun of because it's usually really horrible music, but it seems significant that we don't want things to be quiet ever anymore. And to me, I don't know that I could defend it, but that seems to me to have something to do with when you feel like the purpose of your life is to gratify yourself and get things for yourself and go all the time. There's this other part of you that's the same part that can kind of is almost hungry for silence and quiet and thinking really hard about the same thing for maybe half an hour instead of 30 seconds that doesn't get fed at all. And it makes itself felt in the body in a kind of dread in here. And I don't know whether that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think it's true that here in the US, every year the culture gets more and more hostile. And I don't mean hostile like angry, just it becomes more and more difficult to ask people to read or to look at a piece of art for an hour, or to listen to a piece of music that's complicated and that takes work to understand, because, well, there are a lot of reasons, but particularly now in computer and internet culture, everything is so fast, and the faster things go, the more we feed that part of ourselves, but don't feed the part of ourselves that likes quiet, that can live in quiet, that can live without any kind of stimulation.
So, now I don't know what I wanted to ask anymore. So there was also an episode, a brief interview with Hideous Man, where it was also about this depressed person, this depressed...
You like talking about this story, don't you?
Yeah, I do.
No, that's all right.
Is that bad?
No, it's fine.
And there was something that I read that happens to me very often. I have a friend, and she has multiple sclerosis, and that's a very bad thing for a young woman.
That's no fun.
No, definitely. And she calls me, and as soon as I pick up the phone, she instantly begins to talk, about her sickness and what she takes, and about going to the hospital. And
now, is this part going to make it onto the interview? Are we going to hear this part?
No.
No. Okay, that's what I figured. All right, keep going. Keep going.
Everything I say is not going to make
Fine.
it anywhere,
Okay.
so
Great.
don't worry about that.
Great.
But I thought you wanted to have a conversation, so...
Yes,
okay.
no, this is good. I'm just wishing this is good.
Well, they can hear it, but it's not making it to the show.
All right.
So she calls me, and the moment I heard her name, just say, I think, oh shit, okay. The next couple of hours are gone, because she's telling me all that stuff, and on the one hand, I know she has really got to get that out, and it's somehow my duty, because I like her, to hear that. But on the other side, I think of my, my free time, and I thought, well, I was just sitting here and now I have to hear all this stuff, and afterwards. But when it's over, okay, I think, well, it's good that I,
Yep. Imagine, though, if she called you up late at night and talked to you for 2 hours and it was mostly apologizing for bothering you, so that it's just one more layer of frosting, which is just something that goes along with kind of a depressive temperament. So there's a lot of narcissism and self-hatred.
Yeah, but what I was thinking is, what is so bad about me, what's wrong with me, that I'm, that I hear her name, and I think, oh shit, again, that happened to me, I shouldn't have picked up the phone. And that's, that's also part of the problem, because on the other hand, there's something that knows that that is something I have to do, really.
Yeah, but it's also, it's not... Well, no. Now we're in this conversation, I'm going to be talking about your specific thing. This doesn't get used, right? No, but it's just kind of... I don't think you're a bad person for... I have a friend who's not sick, but lost her mother, sister, father to cancer, all within 3 years, and then her best friend died of AIDS in San Francisco. This woman had the most terrible 2 or 3 years of anybody I've ever heard of. Pretty good friend of mine, and my heart would sink every time, because it was always painful, and she didn't complain about it. She was doing real good, but it was still. I like things to be pleasant. I'd rather drink my chocolate milk and read a comic book than hear about unpleasant stuff. But the depressed person lady just has another spin on that, which is that she's so worried about that feeling you have of dread that she's calling, that she's going to try to get in there and hate herself for it before you can, and there's a great deal more narcissism in her. didn't like her very much.
Yeah, I have a feeling you get
Yeah, I don't. It's usually really bad not to like the main character of a story, and I haven't done many where I didn't. But this one I didn't like, and so it's just why I smiled. Everybody asked me about this story, and it's like the one I don't want to talk about. But it's fine. It's fine.
No, I also found that you didn't like her, but nevertheless the story is interesting.
But she didn't like herself either. So she would have predicted that I didn't like her.
Do you still, do you watch TV?
I don't have a TV. Because if I have a TV, I will watch it all the time. So there's my little confession about how strong I am at resisting stuff. I think part of the allure of both drugs and entertainment is escape, yes, from my problems and my life and having to be stuck in here. I can pretend I'm James Bond or pretend to. It just it seems fine over the short haul as a way of life. It doesn't work all that well, though, no? Yeah, well, stop me if I'm wrong, but because again, like I said, I did this thing like 7 years ago.
Just say what you think about
No,
it.
I don't quite get the question, because it seems to me like the parts of the book that have to do with drugs have mostly to do with this halfway house, where people who've been doing drugs for 10 years kind of stop and then sort of lose their minds, because all of a sudden now they are starting to feel some of this stuff. So if you're talking about the more general allure of drugs, to the extent that I understand it, which is about as specifically as I'm going to talk about it, it seems to me to be, and this isn't a very original thing to say, it's a pretty natural extension of corporate capitalist logic, which is I want to feel exactly the way I want to feel, which is good, for exactly this long, and so I will exchange a certain amount of cash for this substance. And I will do it, but it's all of course a lie, because the control gradually goes away and it stops being that I want to do it and becomes that I feel I need to do it. One of the reasons I can't own a TV is I've started having this thing where I've become convinced there's something really good on another channel and that I'm missing it. And so instead of watching, I'm scanning anxiously back and forth for this thing that I think I want that I don't even know what it is.
So do you think it's...
90% of this is going to be cut out, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, okay.
Not because I like it, but because, there's, of course...
Because it's not going to make any sense. Yes, right.
Yeah.
Right. But a model of life in which I have a right to be entertained all the time seems to me not to be a promising one. If fighting against entertainment is even required, how does one do it unless... Well, there are two options. One is you direct the attack only to people who are willing to listen to the complexity, but those aren't the people who are enslaved by entertainment anyway. Or you find some way to make the attack on entertainment entertaining, in which case you've been captured by the very thing you're fighting against. It's very, very strange. I don't feel like this is making any sense at all.
It does?
Okay.
I'm sorry, but...
No. Okay, fine. Well, you can run some sort of editing magic.
Yeah, sure, but I don't have to. Infinite Jest takes public place in a tennis academy. So, and you I read, have been a tennis player, a quite good tennis player.
A somewhat good tennis player, not a quite good tennis player. No, I played a lot as a kid. Yes.
And then you said once, well, tennis is a little bit like chess and boxing. It's I don't know if it's a combination of the two or if it's, but you somehow related the three together, tennis, boxing, and chess. So what makes tennis so special? Sorry.
Well, if you're asking why it's in the book, the reason it's in the book is it's the one sport I knew well enough to be able to try to talk about why it was beautiful. And it's also a sport that has to do with two very bounded spaces and sending stuff back and forth between them, which has other stuff to do with the book. I think tennis is a very, very beautiful sport because it's very abstract and geometrical. And tactical like chess, and it's also very, very physical. There's a lot of running. You get very tired playing. I don't know about the boxing thing, unless that it's just usually one person against another person. But it's...
And with chess?
Well, if you're really interested, really good tennis players, like really good chess players, are always thinking 4 or 5 moves ahead. Actually, this was something that some of the German players who were superstars in the 90s were something very good at doing. Boris Becker didn't just come up and hit an ace. What Boris Becker, and I think he learned this from McEnroe, was really good at hitting a forcing serve that made you hit a weak return that let him come into the net and put the next shot away. I mean, so that everything is being thought of ahead. But it's also very combative. You and I are playing. If I win, you lose. I'm trying to beat you. Very individual. But there's also something about it's also combat at a distance. In boxing, the two bodies are very close to each other. There's something a little colder about tennis, which is I'm trying to beat you, but you're 75 feet away from me, and what's traveling between us is just this small thing. There's something more abstract about it, which is a little bit more like chess.
What is literature able to do that other? Sorry.
I saw this on the sheet of paper.
Yeah, because I had to.
Good. So let me ask you first, and then I'll what is it that literature can do that other things can't do?
Well,
It's not so easy, is it?
No, not at all. But I thought you're more intelligent than I am. So I thought. Well, actually, I read this in this interview, and you said something as that good art somehow is able to not make you feel alone in this. And that is something actually that I'm very addicted to, because I'm simple as I am. I'm very happy when I don't feel this so lonesome. Whatever when I read something. And I also, when in good literature is something very musical to me sometimes. That I had that with Bernhard very much, because the sicker he got in his life, the easier his words, the words became, and it was some kind of music.
Huh.
So for me, I have the beauty of the words, and also this musical thing about it. And then also sometimes it's something philosophical and not feeling alone. That's what.
Can we just put that in? That's a better answer to the question than I could have given.
No. First I had to answer that.
Well, play back the tape of what she said, and I'll just. There are big limits on what we'll ever know about each other. I don't know what's in your mind right now. God knows I don't know what's in his mind right now. Most of the friends I've got, and most of my friends don't like to read. Most of the friends I've got who don't like to read find it A, boring, and B, just kind of lonely and slow, and I just don't get it, because watching television for me, although it's easier, is much lonelier. Watching flat images on a flat screen, doing interesting things, and often they're very easy to look at, is very different from knowing what it's like to be inside somebody else's skin, or knowing what it's like to be able to spend 2 hours with an author who somehow can make me feel like I know what it is. I mean, it just seems like a form of magic to me. I can't remember which American writer it was who I heard him speak, and he said that his job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. There are forms of art that offer us escapes from ourselves and our daily lives, and I think that's fine in small doses. And then there are kinds of art that offer us more sort of confrontation. All I did was parrot back what you said, but I took like 10 times as long.
No, that's
and
not.
I did this a lot more. So. Boy, is it hot in here now.
Yeah, it's true. We are right into something that I actually have. Do you want me to get you a little bit of water or something?
No, I'm fine. I'll just be sweating here in my chair. It's fine. Not a problem.
Like the typical American.
Yes, the sweaty American. I'm proud to sweat on behalf of the USA.
So we are just in the middle of a question that I put on this paper, which was somehow faxed or emailed to me. So.
And which I received.
That's good to know. The fear of the writer that his work and his persona somehow made banal, be flattened and abused as soon as the media.
I don't recall that. Where's that written down there?
Here.
Banal?
Yeah, I don't know if it's banal.
Okay.
I think that I made this word up.
How interesting. See, mine stopped here.
Really?
Yeah, there wasn't any of this stuff.
Oh my god.
No, it's fine. So it'll all be stuff. So we're talking about like the marketing of writing stuff.
No, but I mean, it's the fear of the writer that his work and his persona are somehow made into banal. Not only by promoting. Yeah, well, it belongs to promoting.
The work and his persona are the same thing,
No.
but they're both made.
Yeah, but it's when you are out there for the media, what happens then?
I see a paradox here. I'm going to talk about the difficulties of having to deal with the media, but I'm talking to the media.
Sure.
Right. See, I'll pretend I'm talking to you, but when the show's, you're going to have this face, sweaty face, on camera, talking about how difficult it is as a writer to be on camera. In which case, if I were the viewer, I would go, so why is the son of a bitch on camera? So how do you suggest I handle this?
Yeah, no, it's a paradox, but at the same time, I think it's very. I mean, it's a legitimate fear to have. So I think about these things all the time. I think, well, I like literature, but at the same time, why am I doing this, and how am I doing this, and how can I try to preserve these things? So, it's a paradox for me too. So for this reason, I think it's something you can think about.
Sure.
One thing that also very much appealed to me is when you spoke in an interview about existential loneliness, of the yeah.
I said the word existential loneliness.
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I'm German and I sometimes get things wrong, but
No. Okay.
And that's something, I very much like to hear an author say, because that's the one thing I'm searching in the things I read. I'm searching for this testimonies of existential loneliness. So, is that something you still relate to, or?
Well, yeah. If I understand your question, this is the stuff that we were talking about 2 questions ago. There's something painful about being stuck in a body and a consciousness that can't ever except through sort of conversation, can't ever be inside anybody else's. And there's a magic about. Except, see, I don't know that much about music. People who do say that there is a purity with which the composer's emotional state can be felt by the listener that can't be approached by anything else either. There's probably most kinds of art have this sort of magical thing of, for a moment, there's a kind of reconciliation and communion between you and me and you and me that isn't possible in any other way. But it's also the sort of thing, it's so weighty and so general that, especially after he used the word pontificate, I feel...
What does it mean? I have never heard it.
The word pontificate, to speak pompously about very, very complex, abstruse matters. It's a little bit pejorative, but he meant it in a funny way. But it's, and this is something else about, like, being an American. When I hear the word existential now, half of me rolls my eyes. Oh, what a bit, the big, sexy, like, philosophical term, and it becomes hard to speak seriously about it because all I can hear is being made fun of for how serious and boring and dull I'm being. If that makes any sense. Good luck editing. I know that there's a paradox in the U.S. of the people who get powerful jobs tend to go to really good schools, and often in school you study the liberal arts, which is philosophy and classical stuff and languages, and it's all very much about the nobility of the human spirit and broadening the mind. And then from that you go to a specialized school to learn how to sue people or to figure out how to write copy that will make people buy a certain kind of SUV. And yeah, I mean, it's I don't know what I think about it other than that I'm not sure really that it's ever been all that different, because very few of us, and there are things about my job I don't like, but this is one of them that I do like, is that I get to use pretty much everything I've ever learned or think about. And it's actually something that goes a long way when I bitch and moan about, sometimes it's lonely work, and sometimes, you worry that it's not very good. I know that there is, at least in America, an entire class of, and now I'm talking about a very specific class here. I'm talking about upper and upper middle class kids whose parents could afford to send them to very good schools where they got very good educations, who are often working in jobs that are financially rewarding, but don't have anything to do with what they got taught, persuasively taught, was important and worthwhile in school. And that is, I've never really quite thought of it in those stark terms. That's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? When you guys talk about it, what do you conclude from it?
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know really what to conclude from it, Like it's I don't know if this is a phenomenon which is has to do with a certain generation, or is it...
Say a friend of yours your age who you were in school with who's a businessman now would say that you are better off than he, because you're at least getting to use a lot of the stuff that you studied in your actual work, right?
Right.
Yeah. You know what? We could talk about it for a long time. I don't know that I could say anything about it that would be interesting on camera or from an on-camera point of view. My suspicion is that this has got something to do with something that was explained by original sin in Genesis, which is that as we get older, we have to do things to get money to stay alive, and that there are things about that often feel very wrong to us, which is probably really kind of sad. It would be very nice if you cut that out, because that just sounds weird. I don't know. Yeah, I get.
This animation is just part of it, I mean, in your book, you just
It's not that there's anything wrong with being interested in stuff that's interesting and attractive. What it seems to me like here is that television and corporate entertainment, in order to make, because it's so expensive, in order to make money, it has to appeal to a very wide audience, which means it has to find things that a lot of people have in common. And I don't know about you, but here, I think what most of us have in common here are our very most base, uninteresting, selfish, stupid interests. Physical attractiveness, sex, a certain kind of easy humor, vivid spectacle. I mean, that's stuff that I will immediately look at, and so will you, and so will you, and so, right? So it's in our very most base and kind of childish interests that we are a mass. The things that make us interesting and unique and human, those interests tend to be wildly different between different people. So my guess is, in terms of American mass culture as a mass, for things to get significantly different, what it's going to involve is fragmentation in the entertainment industry. When something like what's happened in the American magazine industry, where instead of 3 or 4 magazines with millions of subscribers, you have thousands of magazines, each with a few thousand. That is, if entertainment can get more niche-y, N-I-C-H-E is the English word, it's possible that these companies that put the stuff out can stay alive and make money without having to appeal to 10, 20 million people. Because I don't think it's evil. I think it's just the way that it works. The only way to get 10 or 20 million people all interested in the same thing is to pitch your appeal very, very low.
Hello, it is Christmas time and I'm sitting here by my TV. I've been watching it very much lately because I'm on a holiday and I've been seeing all those programs about all sorts of things, about Icelandics being very happy about Christmas, very gay and also very serious and spiritual, and also seeing Icelandic comic people making jokes, which they are very good at. But now I'm curious. I've switched the TV off, and now I want to see how it operates, how it can put me into all those weird situations. So it's about time. See. This is what it looks like. Look at this. This looks like a city, like a little model of a city, and all the houses which are here, and streets. This is maybe an elevator to go up there. And here are all the wires. These wires. They really take care of all the electrons when they come through here. They take care of that. They are powerful enough to get all the way through here. I read that in a Danish book this morning. And this beautiful television has put me, like I said before, in all sorts of situations. I remember being very scared to it because an Icelandic poet told me that not like in cinemas where the thing that throws the picture from it just sends lights on the screen. But this is different. This is millions and millions of little screens who send a light on you, some sort of electrical light. I'm not really sure. But because there's so many of them, and in fact you're watching very, very many frames when you're watching TV, your head is very busy all the time to calculate and put it all together into one picture. And then, because you're so busy doing that, you don't watch very carefully what the program that you're watching is really about. So you become hypnotized. So all that's on TV, it just goes directly into your brain and you stop judging if it's right or not. So you just swallow and swallow. This is what an Icelandic poet told me once. And I became so scared to television that I always got headaches when I watched it. But then later on, when I got my Danish book on television, I stopped being afraid because I read the truth. And that's the scientific truth, which is much better. You shouldn't let poets lie to you.
And this remastered classic TV clip of Björk looking at her PCB was made possible by PCBWay, who can make you great quality PCBs starting at just $5. Because as we all know, PCB stands for Printed Circuit Björk. And for those interested,
Because I'm so
scale this
busy,
video
it is
from
Christmas
320
time
by
and I'm
200
sitting
to
here
4K
by my
using
TV.
Topaz
I've
Video
been watching
Enhanced
it very
AI
much
and the
lately
Proteus
because I'm
5
hypnotized.
along
So,
with
and
manual
all that's
adjustments
on
to
TV,
find
all
the
those
audio.
programs, because you're so busy
The audio
doing all
is also
sorts of
available
stuff.
Hello.
It is Christmas time and I'm sitting here by my TV because you're so busy very much lately. I always got happy. Stop judging. See all those programs. This is all that's
The fuck? Bitch, you know I'm sexy.
Are we gonna have a problem?
Don't call, just text me, bitches. Okay, get on my They stare cause they know I ain't You know I am that girl. Bitch, don't get it out. It's all my things out. You know I am that girl. Bitch, don't get it out. It's all my things out. Baby.
from
gay!
your old cherry
I
tree.
just really like Doom Gary. I really
I had
like
them make
Gary,
50
okay?
pairs of
That doesn't
clappers
make
from
me
the
gay,
tree.
bisexual, lesbian, or
And from
Chinese
those 50,
lesbian, or
I
whatever you guys
chose
are
just
saying.
one pair.
Okay? My comments, stop
You put
commenting
oil on them.
that I'm gay!
Camellia oil.
Stop
Let
commenting
them
that I'm a
sit for
Chinese
several
lesbian!
weeks in a dark place,
Hundreds
and
and
then
thousands
do
of
it
comments,
again.
all saying, Chinese lesbian, you're a Chinese
That's how you
lesbian,
get
you're a
those
Chinese
beautiful
lesbian, I get
colors. It's
it!
as though you've landed.
I'm not gay, I love gay people,
You
I
also
love
get a
girls
really nice
that
sound.
like other girls. I love
As
gay
for striking
people!
the clappers together,
I love it, okay, I
there's
love
a
it.
cord
Love
wrapped
is
around
love,
here.
bro, love is
It's not wrapped this way for no
like
reason.
I'm not, that doesn't make me
Splay
gay, I'm not
them
gay.
like this, and then strike them together. For
Yeah.
a really nice sound,
I
3
said what
parts
I
of the
said.
strength
I'd
goes to your left
rather be
hand, and
famous
7 to your
instead.
right.
I let all that get to my head.
Here we go.
I don't care, I can't say it.
That's the
I
sound.
said what I said. I'd rather be famous instead. I let all that get to my head. I don't care, I can't say it. She a devil, she a bad little bitch. It'll take a whole lot to settle.
I think about Jack. Not just the sound, but the way it walks. How it lives inside a man. How it breaks you and begs you to dance. And I think about him. Jack.
I am.
Now
lot of the reviews, but a lot of the positive ones seemed to me to misunderstand the book. I wanted it to be extraordinarily sad and not particularly postmodern or jumbled up or fractured. And most of the people, the reviewers who really liked it, seemed to like it because it was funny, or it was erudite, or it was interestingly fractured. So,
what does postmodern mean in literature?
No. It's after modernism.
Okay.
What it means. It's a very useful catch-all term because you say it and we all nod soberly as if we know what we're talking about. And in fact, we don't. There are certain, when I mean postmodern, I'm talking about maybe the black humorists who came along in the 1960s, the post-Nabokovians. I'm talking about Pynchon and Barthélemy and Barth, DeLillo in the early 70s, Coover, and I'm sure I'm leaving out a lot. Let me see.
But that's the camp you put yourself in.
I think
without comparison,
that's the camp that interested me when I was a student. The problem is I think postmodernism has to a large extent run its course. The biggest thing for me that was interesting about postmodernism is that it was the first text that was highly self-conscious. Self-conscious of itself as text, self-conscious of the writer as persona, self-conscious about the effects that narrative had on readers, and the fact that the readers probably knew that. It was the first generation of writers who'd actually read a lot of criticism, and there was a certain schizophrenia about it. It was very useful, it seems to me, because the culture, this was a real beaker of acid in the face of the culture. The culture at the time this came out, this was before, the Youth Rebellion in the 60s, was very staid and very conservative and very Alfred Kazanish. And the problem, though, is that a lot of the shticks of postmodernism, irony, cynicism, irreverence, are now part of whatever it is that's enervating in the culture itself, right? Burger King now sells hamburgers with "you got to break the rules," right? So I don't really consider myself a postmodernist. I don't consider myself much of anything, but I do know that that's the tradition that excited me when I was starting to write.
My childhood home is missing pieces of itself in my memory, more artifact than photograph, and there's nothing I can do about it. I can't visit it. It's been sold and remodeled to the point of unrecognizability. The photos I do have are sparse. I can only cobble together fragments. A window in the background, a fireplace. It feels hard to separate my identity from the place I grew up. And so to save the memory of the house feels, to me, essential. I sat my parents down and had them draw blueprints from memory. They split up when I was young, and their associations to the house and the time they spent there varied dramatically, and their blueprints varied too. I compared them with my own. There was no consistent house. I'm an only child. I'm keenly aware of the fact that at some point, the memory of the house will live only with me. And I have this feeling that if I can't show the people in my life the house, I can't be fully known. I understand why we tried to save the lighthouse, why we stacked sandbags on the shore. I know why I can't get over this idea that the internet is disappearing, and the feeling that what's happening is a loss, a failure. We try to apply permanence to a world that's always changing. We build lighthouses on shorelines that are constantly shifting. We store memories between an electrical charge that's always dispersing. We pin names on creatures that are always evolving. Decay reminds us that nothing is ever really one thing. It's only ever in the process of becoming something else. A house is just material we've rearranged, a nest to hold us for a season, from environment to home and back again. Decay is what happens when we're standing still, so we don't stand still. Decay happens in the silence, so we fill it with noise. Decay leaves room for uncertainty, so we fill in the gaps. After all, we don't know what might grow.
I thought that I could live for no one else.
my heart, feel the best thing I could do is end it all and leave forever. What's done is done, it feels so bad. Once was happy, now is sad. I'll never love again, my world is ending. I wish that I could turn back time, 'cause now the guilt is all mine. Can't live without the trust from those you love. And no, we can't forget the past. You can't forget love and pride. Because of that, it's killing me inside. It all returns to nothing. It all comes tumbling down, tumbling down, tumbling down. It all returns to nothing. I just keep letting me down, letting me down. In my heart of hearts, I know that I could never love again. I've lost everything, everything, everything that matters to me matters in this world.
Are all the accomplishments of humanity fated to be nothing more than a layer of broken plastic shards, thinly strewn across a fossil bed, sandwiched between the Burgess Shale and an eon's worth of mud? In order to be true to our nature and our destiny, we must aspire to greater things. We have outgrown our cradle. It is futile to cry for mother's milk when our true sustenance awaits us among the stars.
And everything is going to the beat. And everything is going to the beat. And everything is
I journeyed long and walking far beyond the place of stopping.
Where there was no more returning to the people I had known.
I saw the world forgotten, where the grass gives up on growing.
And I knew that I would never make another journey home.
Upon that fleshy plain, below the final rock of dropping,
stretched the vast and empty desert of the fleeting thing.
encompassing the earth to the horizon,
All-consuming, crying in a thousand voices to its desolate
and the music of its cry never dared to ever die.
Set me running in a madness I could scarce compare to fear.
Not to safety, but to silence unto my own making.
And yet now, upon awaking, once again saw my here.
I long to taste the food of the earth. I long for
My thirst, nothing that remains can satisfy.
for my voice has joined the chorus evermore, ever burning, ever singing, ever hungry, ever dying, never die.
To the parade commander, the 41-year-old Lieutenant Commander Alistair Loudon, falls the task of giving the last command on parade to British troops in Hong Kong. A slow march into a new order. guards march away, the crowd begins to sing, joining in the theme of Auld Lang Syne, as these men march away from their final Hong Kong posting.
One of the most important contemporary developments in post-structuralist and postmodern thought is the work of Lyotard, and his book, The Postmodern Condition, crystallizes and essentializes some of the main themes in contemporary thought. And since Lyotard himself is still alive, his thought is still developing, it's interesting to see what sort of take contemporary living thinkers are taking on the way in which postmodernity confronts the tradition of modern science, modern politics, and modern ethics. Lyotard is what I would describe as an anti-essentialist, anti-foundationalist thinker. He rejects the idea that there's some fundamental reality that we can disclose through some sort of demythologizing procedure. In this case, his views are rather similar to those of Barthes or Foucault. All these postmoderns are united in what they don't like as opposed to what they do like, what they don't approve of as opposed to what they do approve of. And postmodernism endorses the idea that we can't have totalizing discourses anymore. We can't have one unified story which accounts for and legitimizes all our moral and political and scientific claims. We live in the jungle. We live in a totally amoral universe, independent of scripture, independent of revealed religion, independent of the will of God. There's only the will of man. Instead, what Lyotard does, and this is one of the most interesting moves that he takes, he has done a very close and thorough reading of Ludwig Wittgenstein, which is quite remarkable given the kind of sealed-off characteristic of 20th century continental philosophy. There are only a few that have made the tremendous effort to try and accommodate the Anglo-American tradition of, first of all, scientific realism, but second of all, the sort of pragmatic alternative to that that develops when positivism breaks down. So what Lyotard does is take certain Wittgensteinian ideas, specifically the idea of the language game, and uses that as his paradigm for knowledge. And he uses that because it is the key to his idea of little narratives as opposed to big narratives or grand narratives. The goal of his thinking, of his undermining or sabotaging of the modernist tradition of totalizing meta-discourses is the liberation of human beings, particularly the construction of a politics that would respect, as he puts it, the desire for justice and the desire for the unknown. Certain things to emphasize there. First of all, the word desire, right? So our goal is to satisfy certain sorts of desires, some desires rather than others, particularly our desire for justice, although Lyotard very carefully refrains from telling us exactly what justice is. We just know that our politics is directed towards achieving that goal, whatever it turns out to be. And the second thing that's involved in that is a respect for our desire for the unknown. And here the connection between postmodernity and the tradition of romanticism in the West, the love of mystery, the unknown, uncertainty, powerful sentiment, powerful emotion, one might be tempted to say that 20th century culture, and certainly postmodern, post-World War II culture, is romanticism revisited, or a return of romanticism, romanticism squared. We emphasize heroic individuals performing their own indeterminate tasks with powerful internal activities and with an enormous amount of unrestrained narcissism. So for all these reasons, I would be inclined to say that that postmodernity is nothing new, oddly enough. We hear the drums of a primitive heroism in this book. In fact, what it is a rehearsal and a reconstruction and a refurbishment of certain ideas characteristic of the criticism of the Enlightenment, which is being used in the same way that the Romantics criticized the Enlightenment in order to criticize the contemporary status of politics, science, and ethics. So I would be inclined to say that postmoderns relate to moderns the way Romantics related to the great scientific figures of the Enlightenment. And that's why they're perpetually in opposition. And that's why they're perpetually discontented. There was a time long ago when indignation was an emotion. Now it's a job. It turns out then that what this generates is a sort of philosophy of resistance, a philosophy of negation. And the advantage of this is it allows him to inquire into, to interrogate the facts of the world, the status quo, the world as it is, and to recreate that world on the basis of this small narrative interrogation. Also, take note of the use of the word interrogation in postmodern discourse. It crops up all the time. And it is hardly an unbiased turn of phrase. We interrogate criminals. We interrogate those suspected of doing some evil. Postmodernism is not a logically coherent system. It is a sort of organized set of emotions. It is systematic distrust, organized skepticism, systematic suspicion. And what does it suspect? It suspects all those sites of power in the modern world. It distrusts science, it distrusts politics, it distrusts ethics, it distrusts everything except itself. Right? Which again would link it back up to that romantic naivete of objecting to everything except romanticism. Right? So there is a little cul-de-sac always pulled out from this domain of critical inquiry where postmoderns can rest among each other and don't end up criticizing or inquiring too hard or interrogating too closely other postmodern discourses. The difficulty is that while postmodernity claims to be a sort of generalized critique of the world, in fact, it's used by intellectuals for the purposes of intellectuals, and I'll try and articulate that, how that works a little bit later on. But let's look at Lyotard's text, The Postmodern Condition, which has as its goal the construction of this new politics. First thing he wants to do is inquire into the status of knowledge. The book itself was written at the behest of the Quebec government. All right, so it has connections directly to political life. It's authorized by a governmental agency. And after he gets political power, what he wants then is more political power. And what happens in Lyotard's deconstruction or his reinterpretation or his interrogation of the postmodern condition is that he finds that our modern paradigm of knowledge has disappeared. Cutting-edge intellectuals can no longer take seriously the legitimizing grand narratives that had held together modern thought and modern science and modern politics. And Lyotard emphasizes the fact that the legitimation of science and the legitimation of the state are always bound up. In other words, the condition of knowledge and the circumstances and the way in which we legitimize knowledge claims always has reference and connection to the way in which we legitimize political claims, particularly claims about political coercion and its legitimacy. So what Lyotard is doing in analyzing language, knowledge, and trying to find out what sort of mechanism, what sort of mental activity holds it together, he is also suggesting that if nothing holds knowledge and science together, and we can't legitimize that, we are also unable to legitimize, at least unable to legitimize in the usual way, our political preferences. And so this means that we have a vast empty field. We have political life, we exist as social animals, and yet the old ways of legitimizing both knowledge and politics are over. And that means that knowledge is indeterminate and uncertain and rather in a chaotic state now, and so is our notion of political legitimacy. So this is what his long-term view is. His goal is to talk about politics. He's going to talk about politics through the means of an epistemological critique. Now, take a look at some examples of modernism in science and politics and art, which are characterized by their reference to these meta-narratives, things that Lyotard thinks he's gotten beyond. For example, Hegelianism, referring back to the career of the Geist as organizing all of human history, clearly a modern sort of an idea which can no longer be taken seriously. Along with the Geist, we're going to chuck out class conflict, the Marxist perspective, the Marxist totalizing narrative, because that won't fit the bill either. The folk, right? The idea of the various populist or National Socialism, a generalizing, totalizing meta-narrative which has purely mythic status. No one can take that seriously anymore. Same sort of thing is going to apply to things like performativity, which is what Lyotard calls the ideology or the ideological value structure of modern natural science. I'll talk about that in some detail later on. And also, it's not possible for us to generate a totalizing meta-narrative around the idea of a communicative linguistic ethics. And very clearly here, he is taking a shot at Habermas. Habermas, as you know, was one of the last exponents, or one of the final products of the Frankfurt School of Marxism. And what he did was generate a kind of quasi-rationalistic idea that it was possible to reasonably legitimize moral judgment based upon the possibility of a rational consensus about ethics. Lyotard objects to that idea. He says, first of all, that it is not possible to legitimize our moral judgments with any kind of legitimizing meta-narrative, so that's gone. That's not even worth consideration. Second of all, Lyotard thinks the idea of consensus is unjust. He is opposed to consensus. It'll be a revaluation of all values. He's going to stand the Christian and the Platonic view. One of the characteristic postmodern moves is to try and systematically generate dissensus. The more dissensus we get, the more free we are. The more we reach consensus, the more we are under the secret and hidden constraints of totalizing meta-narratives. So he thinks, in other words, that Habermas's project of founding a moral justice and legitimizing moral and political choices is based upon something that is ultimately totalitarian and modernist, in the sense that it is outmoded, that is not seriously a possibility for living intellectuals now. So what he's saying then is that all of these grand narratives are gone. And the question is, what are we going to replace them with? I mean, how now will we go about legitimizing any political activity or any political utterance, moral utterance, scientific utterance? Second of all, if what we mean by legitimizing something is referring back to a grand narrative, and there are no grand narratives possible anymore, it means in the earlier sense of legitimacy and legitimation, it's just not possible. And that raises a whole series of funny questions. How is it possible to criticize political life and offer policy alternatives without implicitly making some affirmation? In other words, there's more than a little double dealing here, and the same sort of move that we see with Foucault, a relentless and very powerful tendency towards negation, with a relatively circumscribed and relatively underplayed and soft-pedaled commitment to the idea of affirmative propositions. He has not figured out, at this time anyway, how we will go about affirming and legitimizing affirmative propositions about politics and ethics and things like that. I'll go into detail in the problems that are generated here. Now, here's where Wittgenstein comes in. Wittgenstein, with his idea of language games, says that the domain of the social practical use of language doesn't have one architectonic skeleton key that the positivists had longed for, which would allow us to discern the truth value of every meaningful utterance. Just isn't possible. Instead, what we have is an overlapping set of language games, a sort of pragmatic interaction between the two, where they don't positively line up, they don't perfectly coincide, and that's just the way the world is. There is no skeleton key. There is no string which leads us out of the labyrinth of language into one determinate system, one archetype of what all language does. So Lyotard's idea of little narratives as the alternative to grand narratives is in some ways a recapitulation of Wittgenstein's idea of language games, and what he's saying then is reinforces the Wittgensteinian message that there is no essence to language, there's just a set of social pragmatics connected to language. And what this does is undermine, as Wittgenstein saw, the claim of positivism to be a universal standard, a universal litmus test by which we judge meaningful and meaningless communication. What Lyotard does is realize that this idea undermines all such structures. And by radicalizing this, he ends up with a deeper and more profound set of philosophical problems, philosophical skepticisms that Wittgenstein ever had. Wittgenstein didn't take it nearly so radically, nearly so far as Lyotard himself did. All right, now let's look at Lyotard's critical work here in this very short book. You'd be surprised that for the amount of ground Lyotard covers and the amount of new and interesting ideas he generates, it's surprising that the book is about 100 pages long. The Postmodern Condition. It's a remarkably transparent and lucid little book. For those of you who have not had access to postmodern texts in the past, want to get a start on it, I think that Lyotard is a very accessible start. And the book is small, it is not overwhelming, it's not entirely loaded with neologisms, although there are enough of them there. And of all the texts in the postmodern genre, the postmodern tendency, I would say this is the easiest, most accessible, and most digestible. So I'd recommend to you, if you want to start reading this stuff, start with that. It makes a lot of this stuff make more sense than it would otherwise. Now, within this text, let's look at the critiques, the criticism that Lyotard offers of two leading thinkers whom he describes as being modernist, and that means outmoded, of course. Only someone who spent a lot of time in the academy would be able to describe modern things as outmoded. All right? Think about it this way. The first of these modernist targets is Jürgen Habermas and critical theory. Here what Lyotard is criticizing is Habermas's idea of an ideal speech situation. He says, look, although Habermas wants to generate a cognitive linguistic ethics based upon this hypothetical, perfect, undistorted communication, the problem is that that's not even possible in theory, much less in practice. And what you're really doing here in trying to generate a consensus is enforce a totalitarian, stultifying, uncreative myth on people who really have no grounds for generating this consensus. In other words, what Lyotard is saying is that consensus defies justice and undermines justice. And the reason why it undermines justice is because it prevents other alternative discourses, other alternative kinds of speech and thought from proliferating and blooming. In other words, what Lyotard is objecting to in the discourses of modernity is their totalitarian tendency. If you are in possession of the absolute truth or the sole truth or the ultimate glyph of reality, which allows you to discern the substantial truth beneath all the appearances, well, then that means that you should cut no one any slack, and you should certainly allow for no alternative perspectives, because that can only be mistaken and wrong. Lyotard believes that that has been what's wrong with Western culture since the time of Plato. It has been essentially totalitarian because all totalizing discourses gesture at the necessity of silencing all other discourses. So they are what Lyotard calls terroristic. So strangely enough, Jürgen Habermas, trying to revive and resuscitate the tradition of Western rationalism, the dignity of the human subject as it was traditionally thought of in the West, is in fact complicit with the totalitarian policies of the modern age. Lyotard wishes to lead us out of that wilderness towards a domain of human freedom, towards a domain of real justice, and towards a domain of human creativity, where new kinds of speech, new kinds of talk, and new kinds of thinking can be accepted as legitimate, where we resist the totalitarian modernist temptation to silence the other, to silence the differand, as Lyotard describes it. And he has a whole set of neologisms and a whole theory behind the discourses of the other. It involves something called the differand. I'll explain that in a little bit, but the point here is that we have to have what Mao said, let 100 flowers bloom. Well, Lyotard wants an infinite number of discourses to bloom. A new Roman Empire. There can be new glory, a new this world. And he says that's human felicity, because among these discourses are the real intellectual breakthroughs or the intellectual achievements of tomorrow. The more you systematically undercut these new and creative discourses, the more you are truncating the domain of human freedom and limiting the domain of human possibility. So this is a philosophy of resistance. It is a philosophy of negation. It resists and negates the modernist tendency towards subsuming all of thought under one aegis. And the result of this is that we end up with something like, well, something analogous to what Freud called polymorphous perversity. We end up with a polymorphous perversity of discourses. Some of them are what we might call orthodox science, but others of them might be scientifically dubious. Astrology, sociology as a soft science. Some of them might be things like, I don't know, alternative readings of aesthetic texts. Some of them perhaps very dubious, but then again, how can you tell what's dubious and what isn't? You can only say that a text or a reading or an approach to science or mathematics or any intellectual activity was dubious if you were in possession of the sole and real substantial truth. Suppose there is no such thing. Well, then we would have good grounds for allowing this profusion of discourses. And this would extend the domain of human activity, and this is what is actually good for people. This is, in other words, a new telos, a new goal for political life. Our goal is to maximize difference. This is the celebration of diversity, which you hear so much about nowadays. What he's saying is that diversity is an intrinsically good thing, and the more of it you have, the better it is. And any attempt to restrict this, to silence someone who is generating an alternative discourse, is in fact to terrorize that person. It is an unjust and oppressive activity. So what he is trying to do is create a special space which legitimizes the discourses of difference, which legitimizes alternative ways of looking at the world. And this is, if you think about it, entirely consistent with his perspectival ontology and epistemology. If there is no one unifying meta-narrative, then the best we can do is have local Wittgensteinian language games. But as Wittgenstein emphasizes and jumps to point out to us, you can't use one of these language games as if it were a privileged domain from which to judge all the others. They're all on the same level. The old Platonic and Cartesian dream of a hierarchy of knowledge, which will allow us to climb Jacob's ladder into heaven, is over. We're not going to heaven. We're stuck here on the earth, and we're stuck here with finitude and contingency and uncertainty and an infinite number of, well, mutually irreconcilable perspectives. In some ways, this is homage to Nietzsche as well. The perspectivalism that's characteristic of Nietzsche's outlook, of his ontology and epistemology, is here in spades. All right? It's not so much that this is new as it's more radical than we've seen before. Now, in addition to criticizing Habermas and the idea of communicative linguistic ethics, he also attacks Niklas Luhmann. And Niklas Luhmann is one of the leading lights of systems theory, which is an attempt to talk about the modern world as a large ateleological, which is to say cybernetic system. So it's derived from the theory of cybernetics, but it is applied not just to the domain of computers, but to all systemic interactions, which could include things like social systems or the system of your body, the various circulatory and respiratory systems. The interaction between systems and the formalization of these interactions is what systems theory is all about. And what Lyotard dislikes about Luhmann and dislikes about systems theory is, first of all, the idea that it is deterministic, right? It is a closed system. In that sense, it is a modernist, totalizing meta-narrative. And he says, first of all, there is no such thing. That is not intellectually respectable anymore. Second of all, and this is the big point that Lyotard makes, there is a hidden agenda built into systems theory, built into Niklas Luhmann's project, and that's the legitimizing of what Lyotard calls performativity. This is a very important idea. This idea gets thrown around quite a bit nowadays. Performativity is the value that is built into advanced capitalism. What performativity means is maximum output for minimum input. In other words, it's the ideology of efficiency. Right? And all capitalist undertakings within this sort of an economic and social system, regardless of what people are trying to produce, all genuflect towards that value. Whether you're producing cars or stereos or lectures on philosophy, you want to get the most kicked out in the minimum amount of time. And that efficiency is understood as being intrinsically rational and intrinsically logical and intrinsically self-justifying. And Lyotard's point is that it's not. It's an ideological construct which only can be taken seriously if you're willing to accept that as a totalizing meta-narrative. The point is that we have no grounds for doing such a thing, and we have good grounds, good Wittgensteinian grounds for rejecting such a thing. So performativity, which is the basic fundamental value of advanced capitalist society, turns out then to be just another one of those coercive myths. Right? And he's gotten to the bottom of it, sort of, until we get to the kind of scorpion sting at the end of this. Let's have a look at this criticism of performativity. How are we going to get out from under performativity? Should we be irrational in the sense of being inefficient, ineffective? Should we be counter-performative? Hard to know what to do. Well, what Lyotard formulates as the solution to this both scientific and political problem is, he says, look, I have an idea. Let's give up on the theory of science, because that would be just another one of those totalizing meta-narratives. No such thing. No such thing as scientific method. So he's borrowing a page from, if you know the work of Feyerabend, or even perhaps a less radical formulation, Thomas Kuhn, saying, look, there's no such thing as the scientific method. There's one paradigm and there's another paradigm, but it has no internal logical coherence. Right? It's a set of pragmatic activities which works or doesn't work and gets accepted or doesn't get accepted. Nothing really holds them together. Key thing here then is, if there is no method to science which holds it together, how shall we investigate science and its claims to performativity and the connection between the legitimation of science and the legitimation of the modern state? And he says, I have an idea. Instead of looking at the theory of science, let's look at the practice. Let's look at what he calls the pragmatics of scientific activity to see the way in which the everyday, concrete interaction of society biases science and alters its allegedly objective domain and activities. And what he says is something like this. He says that science has caught us up with this idea of performativity, and the way out of this is to advocate what he calls parology. In other words, counter logos, counter speech, counter thought, counter ideas or thinking. In other words, alternative systems of thought for science and for art and for politics and for ethics. In other words, he wants an infinite plurality of perspectival stances, none of which can make an affirmative claim towards being better than any other. There is a dark and sparkling brilliance to this, like black diamonds. You look at it and you realize that, however horrifying his conclusions, there's a certain grim truth in what he says. And he says that performativity locks that idea out. It resists that idea, and in the process of resisting that, it means that it is committed, that modern science and the modern state are committed to silencing the different, to silencing the other, to systematically coercing people that want to create new and creative and alternative views of the world. They are no longer able to articulate these views because these views have been delegitimized by a covert ideology which by itself has no sufficient or satisfactory claim towards universality. Okay, so what he wants to do then is to give us a new goal for science. That would be one way of thinking about it. It used to be that the goal of science was the description of the world, mimesis. Can't do that anymore, that's old-fashioned. Now the goal of science is to manipulate and magnify and increase the number of alternative discourses about the world, to give us the maximum kaleidoscopic view of the world. So we have this sort of fly's eye view, an infinite number of little images, none of which are identical, none of which can claim to be better than the other. This is what parology means, and that's what he's looking to do. He's looking to create a paralogical science, in which no intellectual activity, natural science or art or politics or anything, will make any totalizing claims to being able to judge the other alternative discourses. What this does is gives us good reason to resist the terroristic modern tendency to silence the other. If your goal in science is to generate the maximum diversity of discourses, the maximum alternity of perspectives, then here we have a new, freeing, liberating science which can help usher in the next age, the next generation, by making us open to the possibility that there are other legitimate ways of looking at the world, and keeping these self-imposed blinders off our thinking about other alternative discourses. In other words, this will be the valorization of marginality, which is a very important word nowadays. It takes discourses that have been ignored and vilified and condemned and marginalized and says they're just as good as any other kind of discourse. And what we want then is it's a very Democratic sort of a theory in the sense that it wants to say that opinion is the same thing as knowledge because we have no way of gesturing at any substantial reality which would legitimize our knowledge. So then there's just persuasion rather than being convinced, because you can only be convinced by certain knowledge, substantial reality, and there's no such thing. So we just have persuasion. Some people are persuaded of some things, some people are persuaded of others. Some people are persuaded to look at the world in one way, some people have different life experiences, different inclinations, are persuaded to look at the world in another way. But there's no ultimate Urstoff that we can gesture at, which would give us good grounds for choosing one over another. You can see how he departs radically from Habermas here, who thinks that the whole point of philosophy is to find some such thing. Elsewise, it ends up being organized chaos. Now, what he's trying to do then, and it's an unfinished question in his book on postmodernism, he wants to ask the question, can parology legitimate a politics of resistance? In other words, can we find a new way of legitimizing our political choices, our moral choices, and our scientific understanding of the world based upon this goal or idea of parology, on this infinite profusion of discourses and perspectives? We might want to say that parology, that the status of being an outsider to the majority or to the mainstream of discourse, is another way of talking about the condition which intellectuals sometimes call alienation. And if Lyotard wishes us to pursue parology as an end in itself, I think that what he's telling us is that alienation is an intrinsically good state of affairs, and that any real intellectual has to be alienated. Elsewise, you're being coerced by the dominant regime of discourse. So to be really free is to be constantly negating, constantly saying no, I don't think so, I'm not willing to accept that. In other words, it means that naysaying, negation, rejection, it means that undermining of established verities and suspicion has now become an end in itself. It's not a means towards any substantial reality. Now it just gives us something to do. All right? So we really are gesturing in the void, gesturing in the dark and at the dark towards God knows what for God knows what reason, because there are no reasons to give. And here we end up in a position where we're drifting in the direction of Barthes, we're drifting in the direction of talking to ourselves, right? And not even that, because it means that the rules of our language game will change not just from person to person, but over time. My language games now are very different from my language games when I was 5. But there's no real improvement. I mean, I adopted one set of linguistic rules then, and I adopted another set now. And you can't say that one is better than the other, it's just different. It is an exceedingly democratic and exceedingly reassuring ideology, because it means that everybody's right, and that it's basically impossible to be mistaken, except of course if you're a modernist, in which case it is possible. Although he never exactly explains how, or what it would mean to be mistaken, or how modernists could possibly be in some condition of misapprehension. If postmodernity is right, it seems to me that this criticism of totalizing meta-discourses loses all explanatory force. It's one of the great difficulties that's going to emerge here. Thou, nature, art my goddess, and to thy law my services are bound. And I think we should look at Lyotard as being a postmodern gamester, because there's a very playful element to this activity of criticizing everything, just in the name of criticizing things, and just in the name of creating dissenses, which he thinks is just intrinsically good. The more alienated and angry and separate and apart intellectuals are from the dominant mainstream culture and from each other, the more individual language games there will be, and the more quasi-communication or miscommunication or non-communication or whatever it is that goes on now in lieu of communication there will be. So instead of going back to one universal paradigm of knowledge which made possible clear communication, now we'll go to an infinite plethora of models of knowledge which leaves the status of communication in great doubt. There's a whole series of problems connected with Lyotard's postmodernity. Let's start with the beginning. The first and biggest problem here is that if real or if accurate or satisfactory or just discourse, you almost don't know what to say about this idea of parology, if that is the way we should approach science and knowledge and thought and legitimation, if there is an infinite number of language games with an infinite number of infinitely complex rules, each of which is separate to every individual, it generates the question of how is and to what extent is communication possible at all? Aren't we all playing our own language game, and don't these language games change at every instant in time, in which case aren't we just making noise? Doesn't this just change all of intellectual discourse into scat singing? Only the people who don't understand what scat singing is would actually ask, well, what do the lyrics mean? The lyrics don't mean anything, it turns out. It's just a way of making noise and gesturing at the domain of your perspective. And here we see it folding into that position of Barthes, that interiority, that retreat to within the self. And I think that there's a tendency, not just in Lyotard, but in all of postmodernity, to reject the external world because it gets in the way of our egocentrism. So the idea that we can no longer have totalizing meta-discourses, and instead we're stuck with an infinite plurality of language games, it seems to me undermines the possibility of communication at all. And it makes it very hard to be sure what we're talking about. And Lyotard doesn't make it any easier. He says that justice is still an important value, even though consensus is not, but never tells us what justice is. And not only that, but it does beg the question of, well, not only what do you mean by justice, but is your justice the same as mine? One assumes not. So why do I have to pursue your justice? What's it to me? I have my own little discourse. I don't need your help. I can be confused on my own. Right? So this activity of subjectivizing and radical relativism for both knowledge and speech and language ends up moving perilously close to solipsism and making communication impossible altogether. And he has written a whole book on this theme, a whole book on this problem, and it's probably his greatest book. It's called The Differond. And what a differond is it's a site, and here I mean in a metaphorical, not a literal sense, a site of non-communication between incommensurable and untranslatable discourses. And the problem with the differond is that in the modernist conception of the world, there should be no such thing. If there is one big totalizing meta-discourse, then whenever people have a fundamental disagreement, an untranslatable conflict about the nature of the world, one of them has to be right, one of them has to be wrong. They can't both be right. Lyotard says no. The simple brute fact of the world is that there is no totalizing meta-discourse. It's not the truth that one of them has to be right. Both of them can be right, or more precisely, it doesn't mean anything to describe either of them as being right or wrong. It's just what you like and what you don't like. Not good in the sense of morally good, because that's only for old ladies and kids. Nobody seriously believes that stuff. All right? Now, look at the way this is going to work, because when we look at the examples of it, it becomes a lot clearer. What he says is, look, there are certain systems of signs, certain ways of describing and organizing the world and articulating the world, which prejudge the answers to the questions it is going to ask, and which are incommensurate and untranslatable with certain other discourses which claim to be describing the same thing. And this leads us to certain verbal impasses. And what it means is that Plato was wrong. The dialectic doesn't lead to truth. It leads to a dead end. It leads to people yelling at each other and then beating each other up. Take an example from contemporary politics. Abortion. There's a group of people who are members of a linguistic community who regard the legality of abortion as a question of killing babies. There is another group of people, a separate community of discourse within the society, that regards the legality of abortion as being a question of personal freedom and personal choice. Now the question is, from the modernist, I guess, what's the real answer? Well, from the postmodern perspective, there's just no real answer. It's not that one side is right and the other side is wrong because they've adopted the right perspective. What you have here is two untranslatable and incommensurate discourses constructed by people that just cannot talk to each other. In other words, and if you formulate your question about abortion within the confines of their linguistic system, within the confines of their discourse, you will have already presupposed the answer. In other words, there is no neutral middle ground in language where we can dispassionately and objectively search for knowledge. There's just an infinite set of perspectives. So what this means then is that abortion is a good thing if you say, is freedom of choice for women a good thing? Well, it presupposes that the answer is going to be yes. If you're going to ask, is killing babies a good thing? You're presupposing that the answer is no. How do you translate those two propositions with both gesturing at the same fact of social reality? How do we find some neutral middle ground where we're not presupposing that? There's Lyotard's point, and it's a deep point. We don't know how to do it. And Lyotard has drawn the somewhat disconcerting inference that perhaps there's no way to do it, and perhaps the longing to do it is an atavistic holdover from our modernist totalizing discourses. Perhaps there's just no such thing. And not only that, perhaps the fact that we can't achieve a consensus about abortion or a great many other matters is a good thing, because that's what ensures freedom, that's what ensures a plurality of possible ways of looking at the world, and that's what prevents totalizing discourse, that's what prevents discourse from becoming totalitarian. We want to let 100 flowers bloom, and if you were able to reduce them all to one universal question and answer format where you get substantial reality, that makes democracy superfluous. So he says then that the only way to get beyond this is to construct a fictitious, mythological, totalizing discourse. If you don't want to do that, then parology is here to stay. It's not something he recently invented. He's just found a way of valorizing it and saying that he likes it, of affirming it. But it's been around all the time. It's been around since the beginning of time. A very interesting kind of an argument, and you might want to go back and look at something like, say, the conflict between, Plato, Socrates, and any of the sophists that he talks to in the dialogues. It's parology. They're based upon different assumptions about the world, and they're talking past each other. Virtu is exactly the opposite of Platonic virtue. It is much more like Thrasymacheian virtue. It is the virtue of the man that tells lies, that stabs people in the back, that does whatever it takes to satisfy his unquenchable desire for power. All right? There's a deep fact about social reality here, that although we may long for some ultimate coherence to our discourses, we don't know what that is, and we don't have very good grounds for believing in such a thing. It's an act of faith rather than an act of knowledge. Another question, another problem that emerges, and this emerges in a wonderful book that he wrote called Just Gaming, which shows how playful, how Wittgensteinian it is. The obvious references to Wittgenstein and the idea of language games. But what's nice about the English translation, because I mean the French was called On Justice, just gaming means just in the sense of only gaming, merely gaming, and also fairly or justly or righteously gaming. So it's a lovely play on words, and of course this is the strong point of Pomo writers, right? Plays on words, puns, ambiguities, that's their strong point. So Just Gaming is a wonderful, almost a better title than the original, the French original. And what we find out in Just Gaming is he wants to investigate the question of, is it possible to use parology and the idea of keeping the differend alive, not silencing terroristically the differend, is it possible to use that as the source of a new legitimation for paralogical postmodern thought? Well, it's a beautiful little discourse. It's done in the sort of form of a Platonic dialogue. And it's done over 7 days, and there's different parts, and lots of witty plays on words, and he deals with many of the important themes in the Western intellectual tradition, this very dense and interesting little book. But the ending of the book is the most important and interesting part. They never really achieve an answer to the question of, can we legitimize politics and ethics and such with parology? As a matter of fact, he defines ethics as judgment without criteria. Something like a Kierkegaard who has affirmed this world rather than the next. So we have that agonizing jump into nothingness, but he's decided to go in the opposite door from Kierkegaard. So criterionless choice, criterionless judgments, that's what ethics turns out to be. And politics based upon parology seems can't legitimize itself either. The way the book ends is most significant and most thoughtful. It ends in laughter. In other words, they stop talking altogether. All Lyotard does in response to the question, without really solving it, is to laugh. I would direct you back to Plato's dialogue called the Meno. In the Meno, he's talking to a guy named Meno, who was taught by the greatest of the sophists named Gorgias. And in that dialogue, it comes out that when Gorgias gets asked what human virtue is, instead of answering, he just laughs. That's the answer. Gorgias is the great practitioner of parology. And what this does is dissolve the domain of communication into a sort of giddy, self-indulgent laughter. It means that this is a huge practical joke, and you can see that this game is in fact both serious and facetious at the same time, which is so postmodern. It has both qualities simultaneously. Don't take it too seriously, but then again, don't ignore it either, because it is simultaneously serious. It sort of undoes the category, undoes all those binary distinctions, which is a big postmodern project. Now, a final objection or difficulty that's going to emerge in Lyotard. It's not the only one, but I think it's one of the most important. This idea of terror, and the idea of silencing the differend as being a terroristic kind of politics. Now, I'm pretty sure that we're supposed to think terror is bad. Get the idea? I mean, it's hard to think of the nice connotations of terror. There aren't very many of them. And yet, what, say, the French Revolution meant by terror, or what the victims of Nazi atrocities or the Khmer Rouge atrocities might have meant by terror, is not what Lyotard means by terror, because he's Pomo. What he means by terror is silencing the differend, which is a very unique and enigmatic use of the word terror. And you wonder then what this terror means and who it applies to. Does it apply to everybody? Are we all terrorized if the differend is silenced? Or is it just that, is this just Lyotard's way of saying that the silencing of the differend makes him more worried? And he decided to inflate that feeling to the status of a political principle, an epistemological principle. Avoid terror. What's terror? It's the silencing of the differend, which Lyotard doesn't like. Let's think of some examples of this, and this is where the nightmare comes in. Let's try something like Singapore. Contemporary intellectuals hate Singapore. It's a technocratic government, has very little use for the eternal verities of humanistic discourse, the extension of rights and freedom and subjectivity and all that. And what really irked contemporary intellectuals about it is the fact that the Singaporeans really love Singapore. They seem to be happy. And they resent that unbelievably, because it gives the lie to all their claims about politics. There should be a mass exodus from Singapore. And in fact, they have to guard their borders to prevent people from coming in. And that ought not to happen. What a slap in the face. So constantly, I mean, all intellectuals, or almost all contemporary intellectuals, really hate something like that. Now, the problem is this. In Singapore, they have a certain degree of censorship of the press. It's what I would call a soft authoritarianism. Authoritarianism that knows that real repression or excessive repression is real counterproductive. And so they limit what we put in the press. And you know what I'm asked to believe by Leotard? These people are all terrorized because they don't have a completely free press. They're silencing the Differon. And you know what's even more strange? The people in Singapore don't seem to realize how terrified they are. Isn't that remarkable? A whole collection of people, all of whom are under this terrible condition of terror, and they don't even know it. They don't want to leave. They seem actually happy. Isn't what is a powerful set of illusions? Except that, what do you mean by an illusion? How could they possibly be wrong? Why isn't that just another language game? And the snake begins to eat its own tail, and we find out that all this amounts to is that we have to avoid the things that worry Mr. Leotard very much. And this individual personal sentiment gets raised to the status of a political principle, like one of those floats at the New York Thanksgiving Day Macy's parade. We carry in something much larger than life size. It's just an inflated image of something that's actually very human, perhaps human, all too human. Think about the fact that in contemporary America, when we have presidential debates, we don't have every party. We don't have the Friends of the Moon fringe party in to debate with President Clinton. Instead, we have a limited domain of people that we are willing to extend free airtime to. Apparently everyone in America is terrorized. Apparently you're terrified. And the bad part of it is that so few people realize that. It shows how benighted and modernistic you are. It gives the impression that you don't understand the fact that the Differon and the creation of dissensus is an end in and of itself. You probably don't realize that to agree with other people and achieve some sort of consensus is just a way of being coerced by the modernist tradition. So Professor Leotard offers to free us from this and to make us have feelings much more like his. Why it is we should be interested in doing that, why we have some sort of obligation, moral or otherwise, since moral judgment is judgment without criteria, he never really explains. The sense that I come away with, though, is that Leotard's reason for adopting postmodernism and post-structuralism is something like Edmund Hillary's for climbing Mount Everest, because it was there. If you know that movie by Marlon Brando, where he's playing a motorcycle hood, and he comes in and somebody asks him, what are you rebelling against? And Marlon Brando says, what do you got? Well, that's pretty much what postmodernism is. What are you rebelling against? Well, what's here? We're rebelling against that. We're opposed to it. Why? There it is. What sense does this make? We find ourselves really interesting, and we want to invent new discourses, and look, we have to get tenure somehow. We got to write books, so let's be against things. That's what postmodernism amounts to. It's a posture of studied suspicion, a posture of exaggerated logical or intellectual scrupulosity, and the result of this scrupulosity is not intellectual cleanliness, it is intellectual sterility.
Paul Cézanne, the painter, always felt that he had to, I mean, up until the end of his life, until he created the Bathers in like 1907, always felt like he had to create a big painting, both in terms of size, but in terms of a great piece of work. You know, do you think about that?
Well, see, it's different. A book is a different kind of object than a painting. A painting, however big it is taken in all at once. Size is an entirely different component of it. For a book, a big book means the reader is going to have to spend a long time reading it, which means your burden of proof goes up, right? Big books are more challenging, they're more intimidating. So, you know, if you're talking about Infinite Jest, I have a problem with length, and it's one reason why I'm grateful to have found a really good editor. Infinite Jest did not start out to be this long. It started out to be a fractured multiple narrative with a number of main characters, and it became, perhaps I was just in denial that this was going to require great length. At a certain point, it became clear that it was going to be very long. Feminists are always saying this. So feminists are saying white males have, okay, I'm going to sit down and write this enormous book and impose my phallus on the consciousness of the world.
And you say?
If that was going on, it was going on at a level of awareness I do not want to have access to.
So Galileo's big claim to fame is that he helped shift scientific consensus in Europe from the geocentric model, where all the cosmos orbit a stationary Earth, to the heliocentric model, where the Earth rotates on an axis and revolves around the sun like all the other planets. And the legend of Galileo is that the Catholic Church suppressed him because none of those words were in the Bible. It usually goes that the regressive Catholics didn't want scientists teaching heretical ideas, so the Roman Inquisition censored heliocentrists, insisting that the sun orbits the Earth. God said so. For some context, Galileo didn't come up with the idea of heliocentrism. That was actually Nicholas Copernicus, who published his model some 70 years before the Catholic Church declared it formally heretical in response to Galileo reviving it. But you might be surprised to learn that Galileo's trial wasn't only about whether or not heliocentrism was consistent with Scripture. The theory was also evaluated on the basis of its scientific context. And on that basis, it was found to be, quote, foolish and absurd, not based on the opinion of theologians, but on the assessment of other notable scientists, many of whom agreed that Galileo's case didn't hold up. So Galileo wasn't censored because the church was anti-science. Galileo was censored because the church found his claims unscientific. So here's the argument against the Earth's rotation that Galileo had to contend with. If you stood at the top of a tall tower on a rotating Earth and dropped a stone, the Earth and the tower should rotate away from the stone as it falls, so the stone should land some distance to the west. But when we've dropped stones off towers, they fall straight down. Ergo, Earth is not rotating. Now maybe you can already see why this doesn't work. When you drop something from a tower on a rotating Earth, it still lands at the base because it was already moving with the Earth when you dropped it, and famously, an object in motion stays in motion. At the moment it's released, the stone has the same motion as the tower in the direction of the Earth's rotation. So in absolute space, the stone does actually fall in an arc. But if you're an observer moving with the Earth, the only thing you'd see is the stone's motion relative to you and the tower, not its absolute motion. Even if you can't explain this in physics terms, you probably understand it intuitively. But that's only because we've long had ideas like Newton's third law or empirical evidence that the Earth rotates. And so our sense of things like motion, how it works, and what kinds of it we can and cannot see are informed by our context. At the time of Galileo, though, they didn't have that context. What they had were their eyes, which could see things fall straight down, and Aristotelian physics, which was premised on the motion that you see being all the motion there is. The medieval experience of instantaneously concluding absolute motion from visible motion is an example of a natural interpretation, an explanation of ordinary experience that seems self-evident because we don't notice the hidden piece of logic in between some sensory experience we have and the statement we make to describe it. Galilean era people weren't going through the mental process of see rock fall in straight line, think visible motion is all motion, and then conclude that the rock is therefore truly falling in a straight line. The middle step was unconsciously taken, because within the context of the existing language and metaphysics, Copernicanism was patently false. The rock falls straight down. We can all literally see it, but that's the deceptive obviousness of natural interpretations. The tricky thing about natural interpretations is that, while they clearly limit our ability to identify better stories in cases like this, we also kind of can't do science without them. Natural interpretations are all we've got. We literally can't speak or even think an idea without potentially inadvertently creating them. But even past the starting point, trying to take an existing theory and analyze it for natural interpretations is kind of futile. That analysis is probably being done through the same frameworks that the theory was developed in. So the analysis would necessarily have the same blind spots as the thing being analyzed. So if we can't analytically find the hidden incorrect assumptions in our long-standing theories because our analytical tools are tainted by the same hidden incorrect assumptions, how do we find them? Well, by entertaining theories that contradict what we already believe. Theories that look wrong. At least, that's how Galileo did it. Instead of asking what's wrong with the tower argument, he simply asserted that heliocentrism was correct, and then asked, what would have to change in order for this all to make sense? To answer this, he appeals to analogy with an example of shooting a gun on a boat. Whether the boat was anchored or sailing, the way you would aim for and shoot at some point on the boat wouldn't change. You wouldn't compensate for the boat because you intuitively understand that everything on the boat is moving as a unit. As another boat-based analogy, he said to imagine sketching with a pen on a piece of paper on a long sea voyage. Even if the ship is moving the whole time, the drawing is fine because your hand, the pen, and the paper are all moving together. The big motion doesn't leave a trace, only the small relative ones do. As a note, these are not logically robust arguments. They're proposing situations that people can easily imagine and then saying, yeah, so what if Earth was like that? Without any evidence for the analogy holding. But even if he could have justified that comparison, he still wouldn't have disproved the conclusion of the tower argument. He didn't provide an argument for the Earth's rotation. He just showed how this particular argument against it could also be consistent with it. Under the old natural interpretations, a rotating Earth predicts falling objects move in arcs, so the lack of those arcs proves the Earth is at rest. But under the new natural interpretation from the boat analogies, a rotating Earth predicts that there's no relative lateral motion between the stone and its starting point, and so all the falling stone shows is that there's no relative lateral motion between the stone and its starting point. Now again, I need you to look at this not through our 21st century eyes, but through the eyes of a scientist back then. If Galileo presented you with his boat analogies, you'd probably be like, cool theory, bro, but can you prove it? We can see today how holding up a demonstrably wrong theory did in fact help Galileo identify an incorrect natural interpretation that was preventing scientific progress, but that's not the same as arguing for the correct interpretation. He had effectively no theoretical basis for believing heliocentrism over geocentrism. Those theories wouldn't be available until Isaac Newton published his work on universal gravitation decades after Galileo's trial. All Galileo's shown is that, at least as far as the tower argument goes, heliocentrism and geocentrism are degenerate. Not degenerate like me, degenerate like when two situations explain the same observation but the observation alone can't distinguish which one's right. The boring kind of degeneracy. And if you were a scientist who came up at a time when geocentrism was supported by the physics, had many observations that were consistent with it, and had successfully made predictions that were useful, you'd have no reason to abandon all that for a competing theory that's main argument boils down to, but like, what if the Earth was a boat? You'd tell Galileo to come back when he had some goddamn proof. And you might be thinking, isn't that what he did with the telescope? He proved it, right? So the tower argument was about whether or not the Earth rotates. But as you'll recall, the Copernican model also asserts that the Earth, like the other planets, revolves around the sun. And here's the refutation for that point. If Earth orbited the sun along with, say, Mars, then sometimes we'd be on the same side of the sun, and sometimes we'd be on opposite sides, which means the distance between us and Mars changes a lot. If that were true, we'd expect Mars to look a lot bigger when it's closer to us, and a lot smaller when it's farther away. But when people looked, that's not what they saw. Mars' size didn't really change much. This would be consistent with a situation where Mars orbits Earth and is therefore always at about the same distance from it. So once again, heliocentrism was considered debunked. Now the simple story is that Galileo made his telescope, it worked very well, and when he observed Mars through it, he measured changes in its size that were consistent with predictions from the Copernican model. Proof! Evidence. Cold, hard facts. And to an extent, the story is true. Galileo did make a telescope, it did have certain demonstrable abilities, and when he observed Mars through it, he did detect the predicted changes in its size. But there is more to the story than that. To start with, Galileo didn't understand how telescopes worked. Like, straight up, his writings just don't contain a theoretical underpinning to justify the veracity of his telescopic observations. He hadn't read the seminal text on optics until after he made his famous observations, and even then, he admitted himself that he didn't understand the math. Instead, it seems like Galileo developed his telescope through trial and error. And even though it worked well enough to impress people when used on familiar things like counting windows on a distant palace, it was met with skepticism when pointed at the sky. For one, because people at the time believed that Earth things and space things were made of fundamentally different stuff and subsequently obeyed different physical laws, and so there was no obvious reason to jump from trusting the telescope in terrestrial contexts to celestial ones. But also, the telescope itself had serious problems. the images it produced were often distorted with obvious artifacts like skewed shapes or colored fringes. This wasn't such a problem for Earth things where you'd immediately clock any distortion because you know what a tree is supposed to look like. But if you're looking at space things that you've never seen up close before, how are you supposed to tell what's real and what's a telescope glitch? Today we know enough about optics to understand these artifacts. We know what in our images is coming from the telescope and what's coming from space, so we can correct for them in our instrument design or post-processing. We can also use this knowledge in hindsight to say that the artifacts in Galileo's telescopes didn't undermine his observations of Mars that supported heliocentrism. But back then, there were plenty of good reasons not to trust the telescope. One student of Kepler's said it worked great on Earth, but produced illusions like double stars when pointed at the sky. Others noticed that looking at the moon, they could only see features like craters in the central part of the moon, but the outer edge appeared to be perfectly smooth. And others found that they couldn't recreate Galileo's famous observations of Jupiter's moons, with some even saying that they doubted he had made them at all. Not that it matters much, because while Jupiter having moons did mean that things can orbit things besides the Earth, that's not the same as evidence for heliocentrism. And the same goes for him observing the phases of Venus. He detected changes in its visible shape that showed that it orbits the Sun, but that doesn't prove that the Earth does too, it just suggests it by analogy. And there were even models at the time that resolved these observations, for example, by saying that the other planets do orbit the Sun and they can have their own moons, but the Sun is still orbiting the Earth. Now, an observation that would have directly evidenced the Earth orbiting the Sun is stellar parallax. Parallax is that thing where if you're looking at something in front of your face and change which eye you look at it through, it appears to move relative to the background, and it appears to move more the closer it is to your face. Try it, we can all look ridiculous. Astronomers use the same principle to measure the distance to stars, but instead of comparing the view from two different eye positions, we compare images taken from opposite points in the Earth's orbit. Scientists in Galileo's time knew this. They knew that if the Earth orbited the Sun, they should see parallax in distant stars. But Galileo's telescope couldn't detect it. Turns out that's because the stars were much farther away than anyone realized at the time, meaning the shifts would be a lot smaller and need a much stronger telescope to detect, so it wouldn't be another 200 years until Frederick Bessel was able to make that observation. But at the time, the apparent lack of stellar parallax seemed like solid observational evidence against heliocentrism. And remember that this, along with all the evidence for heliocentrism, was based on observations from a demonstrably flawed telescope. So not only was the telescope Galileo used to support heliocentrism highly suspect, but it could also produce observations that directly contradicted heliocentrism. So if you were hoping for the telescope to produce unassailable evidence supporting Galileo's wild speculation, I'm sorry to inform you, but the data is just as wobbly as the theory. And if you're thinking I might still introduce the secret third thing in Galileo's methodology that alchemizes his flimsy evidence and out there conjecture into a satisfying little proof, I hate to disappoint you, but it's not coming. To recap, Galileo took a refuted theory, argued that it could be true, and backed it with a cherry-picked subset of the available observational data, some of which outright contradicted his claim. And yet, he was right.
Science is an essentially anarchic enterprise. Theoretical anarchism is more humanitarian and more likely to encourage progress than its law and order alternatives. The only principle that does not inhibit progress is anything goes.
So that's provocative claim is the thesis of German philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend's 1975 book Against Method, which is where most of the information you've heard so far comes from. And what he means by anything goes is that it's impossible to devise a universally valid set of steps that dictates how one does science that won't eventually stifle its progress. For any scientific rule, there is a useful counter-rule, a time when that rule should be broken. So what rules did Galileo break? By my count, he defied 3 commandments of the scientific method. Yes, we're doing a Bible motif.
Commandment 1. Thou shalt ground thine hypothesis in established knowledge.
So this commandment is what Feyerabend calls the consistency condition, which is the requirement that new hypotheses agree with well-established theories, which is often a good rule of thumb, but clearly an obstacle when it comes to Galileo trying to advance heliocentrism. He didn't build off the existing body of accepted knowledge. He revived an idea that had long been dismissed by the scientific community. Feyerabend argues that this move of actively choosing to explore hypotheses precisely because they contradict well-established theories is necessary for the progression of science for a few reasons. For one, because the consistency condition biases us towards whatever theory came first, not necessarily because it's better, but just because it came first. Think about it. The theory that came first has more time for people to get used to it, to find supporting evidence for it, to build more knowledge around it. Of course, a new theory is going to look weak in comparison. Feyerabend hilariously likens it to arranging a fight between a grown man and a baby, and then being like, oh wow, the man won, I guess the baby never had it in him. Now some might be inclined to argue, well, can't we just decide when a theory is ready to be replaced when we discover enough facts that don't support it? But like we saw with the natural interpretations in the Tower argument, sometimes facts used to support or disprove a theory inherit the same assumptions as that theory. Take Brownian motion. It's the jittery movement of particles in a fluid that scientists had long observed, but under the previously dominant theory of heat, just seemed like a weird curiosity. It wasn't until Einstein applied an alternative theory of heat, which is the one we use today, that Brownian motion was seen to contradict the previous theory. Without the competing framework, the anomaly would never have registered as a problem at all. So collecting enough facts isn't enough to tell us when an old theory is ready to be retired. Sometimes you don't need to look harder, you need to look through a different lens. And that's why sometimes pursuing a hypothesis we already know is wrong is the only way to reveal how wrong we really are.
Commandment 2. Thou shalt discard theories thou hast falsified.
Falsification. You test a theory with data, the test and the theory disagree, you abandon the theory. Popper in a nutshell. Don't worry, we'll get to him. So let's recap the data Galileo had. His telescope succeeded in observing some things heliocentrism predicts, it failed in observing other things heliocentrism predicts, and it also produced very clearly unreliable representations of the sky. Is the data consistent with the theory? Hard to say. Some of it might be, some of it might not. All of it definitely either does or doesn't. What's much easier to say is that the telescope did not produce irrefutable evidence of heliocentrism by any standard. And it turns out, that was fine. An ad hoc hypothesis is an explanation made up after the fact to explain why some test of a theory didn't work. And they're viewed very skeptically in science. Which makes sense in a certain light. Like if you only came up with that explanation after something falsified your theory, then aren't you caring more about protecting your theory than seeking the truth? Sometimes maybe. But sometimes cherry-picking only the bits of data that support your theory and explaining away the bits that don't brings about the Copernican revolution. Just like with accepted theories, accepted facts aren't self-sufficient. They have built into them observational artifacts, hidden assumptions, unknown unknowns. And this is why Feyerabend makes the argument that sometimes you just gotta make an excuse for bad data. Like with the missing stellar parallax observation. Galileo explains it away by saying that maybe the stars are a lot farther away than we thought, and so the shift is too small to observe, and that's why he can't see it. In hindsight, he was right, but he didn't have any way to know that. It was just a lucky guess. But an ad hoc explanation doesn't have to be right to be useful. Galileo explained away one of the obvious problems with his telescope by saying, that's actually something weird that your eyeballs are doing, and the telescope corrects the thing that your eyeballs are doing, so what you're seeing is the image as it really is without the eyeball effect. Which, to be clear, was complete BS. History is filled with wrong but useful ad hoc hypotheses. Newton's theory of universal gravitation, which effectively concluded the Copernican revolution, was one of the most significant advances of physics there have been, but it also relied on God holding up the stars to explain why they don't fall in on each other. And Einstein did pretty much the same thing with the cosmological constant. To sum up in a mantra Feyerabend repeats throughout the book, no theory agrees with all the facts in its domain. And that's why the whole just test your hypothesis part of the scientific method is a little more flexible than we let on.
Commandment 3. Thou shalt let rationality be the final judge of truth.
So if Galileo didn't have strong arguments or evidence, what was he using to advance heliocentrism? Well, mostly a lot of psychology and rhetoric. Take the boat analogies from earlier. That wasn't proof, it was just a metaphor. and not even a strong one, being that at the time, people believed Earth stuff and space stuff obeyed different laws. Even so, these analogies provoked people to think in a different way than they were defaulting to. It simulated a new kind of experience in their imagination. This is one of a few places in Galileo's writing where he appeals to the reader remembering something they already know to kind of trick them into believing something new. He couldn't rationalize heliocentrism, so instead he rewired people's sense of what was intuitive, weakening their trust in the tower argument without directly refuting it. Besides analogies, which at least feel adjacent to arguments, Galileo cultivated an impression of obviousness around Copernicanism through an aggressively persuasive writing style. A lot of Galileo's work was published as dialogues between a Galileo stand-in and a foolish geocentrist, and when the foolish geocentrist asks fake Galileo at some point why he's so certain of a claim that he hasn't tested, fake Galileo says, "Without experiment, I am sure that the effect will happen as I tell you, because it must happen that way, and I might add that you yourself also know that it cannot happen otherwise, no matter how you may pretend not to know it." What follows is fake Galileo walking foolish geocentrists through a highly speculative and hand-wavy proof, after which the latter concedes the inarguable correctness of the former. And I've seen enough of what Facebook did to boomers to know that a confidently presented but materially weak argument can be very compelling. Galileo even just lied sometimes, like claiming he had a theoretical basis for his telescope optics when it appears he did not. Feyerabend calls all of this Galileo's propagandistic machinations, aimed not quite at proving heliocentrism, but at keeping it alive until better proof had the chance to catch up. And listen, I'm not trying to say lying and manipulation is good science, I'm just saying these were his methods. And by most standards, they were wildly unscientific. But that's exactly Feyerabend's point. If an idea doesn't yet fit existing facts or theories, it might need irrational tactics to survive until it can be justified more rigorously. Which makes me think of dramatic physics PR, like the branding around the Higgs boson. I get it was an important part of the standard model, but come on, the God particle? The God particle? Once again, physicists who can't help but invoke God. But also, that language created a lot of public interest in an esoteric physics thing while the data was catching up with the theory. So the takeaway with this last of Galileo's scientific heresies is that scientists are engaged in a messy social process in which things like language and persuasion are necessary to advance ideas before more rigorous methods have the chance to. And I hope that at this point it's not controversial to say that Galileo argued for what is now scientific consensus through thoroughly unscientific methods. And this begs the question, if he wasn't following the scientific method to advance heliocentrism, what was he following? What motivated his ardent support of Copernicanism when it was so clearly flawed? What was driving his scientific inquiry, if not pure reason? Well, what Galileo saw in Copernicus's theory and his telescope's data was not evidence, but what Feyerabend calls harmony. He saw one factually wrong thing, the heliocentric model, and another factually wrong thing, his telescope images, and somehow his intuition convinced him that these things together are a compelling argument. Each individually refutable thing was enough evidence to believe the other individually refutable thing. The telescope supported the theory's trueness at the same time as the theory supporting the telescope's trueness. I know it sounds like I'm explaining this in circles, but that's kind of just what it is. Like, writing this script, I kept finding myself with the Sisyphusian task of trying to rationally describe an inherently irrational process. There's no satisfying way to do it. I don't think I have a better way to articulate what's going on here than Galileo saw something interesting, trusted his gut, and ran with it. Haters be damned. To reference Einstein for a third time for some reason, there is no logical path to the laws of the universe. Only intuition, resting on sympathetic understanding of experience, can reach them. What I'm getting at here is that sometimes the methods of science are surprisingly vibes-based. Every step of Galileo's process required leaps of faith that are not nicely spelled out in the scientific method. But he was right, and he's one of the most well-remembered scientists in history. So the process that Galileo engaged in, where he pursued an idea in contradiction with established theories and facts in order to reveal the incorrect assumptions they were built on, is what Feyerabend calls counterinduction. And to make sense of why we singularly teach the scientific method at the expense of other methodologies like counterinduction, I want to look at the philosophy underneath these methods. The main epistemological basis for the scientific method as you learned it in school is Karl Popper's critical rationalism. Is that a simplification? Yes. Anyways, Popper is the philosophy of science guy from the last century. Like, without fail, anytime I have ever heard physics bros talking about philosophy, they always reference him. And less anecdotally, he's a big deal because he solved David Hume's problem of induction. Induction is generalizing laws from observation of particulars. If you stab a balloon and it pops, you can inductively reason that stabbing balloons makes them pop. But the problem with induction is that the experience of something particular doesn't guarantee the generalization. You can't know for sure whether every single balloon ever would pop unless you try stabbing every single balloon ever. So Hume's problem with induction is that it's the only way to generate scientific laws, but there is no way to prove inductively reasoned laws will always hold. And Popper didn't solve Hume's problem so much as sidestep it, by saying that the point of science is not actually to prove anything. It's to disprove things and see what's left. Popper's philosophy of critical rationalism says that since we can only be certain when something is false, we should design tests to disprove our theories, abandoning the ones that we falsify. And while surviving attempts at falsification doesn't make a theory true exactly, the more we've tried to falsify it without succeeding, the stronger it is. So to Popper, scientific knowledge is not perfect truth, but merely the body of theories that have survived falsification. Which is a bit ruthless, right? Like, it's very survival of the fittest, very trial by fire. Loki is giving eugenics. This is a fundamentally different conception of what knowledge is and how we acquire it than Feyerabend's, which follows directly from his argument for counterinduction.
A scientist who wishes to maximize the empirical content of his views must adopt a pluralistic methodology. He must compare ideas, and he must improve rather than discard the views that have failed in the competition. Knowledge so conceived is not a series of self-consistent theories that converges towards an ideal view. It is not a gradual approach to the truth. It is rather an ever-increasing ocean of mutually incompatible alternatives. Each single theory, each fairy tale, each myth that is part of the collection forcing the others into greater articulation, and all of them contributing via this process of competition to the development of our consciousness.
So if Popper's falsificationism is eugenics for ideas, Feyerabend's epistemological pluralism is like intellectual polyamory. And as I just spent the last half hour explaining, it's well motivated. Galileo's story shows us that adhering to strict falsificationism, in Feyerabend's words,
would wipe out science as we know it and would never have permitted it to start.
Pretending we can decree a theory ultimately finally falsified ignores messy problems like what exactly the burden for falsification is, and under what circumstances a falsification should be reconsidered. Feyerabend's epistemology leaves space for the messiness that Popper's denies. And as someone who has done research, I know what a messy bitch science is, so the recognition of that mess seems needed. But messy reality aside, Popper is science philosophy orthodoxy. In physics and astronomy, at least. I'm sorry, Hume, I can't help but induct. And I think that Popper's epistemology is ubiquitous while Feyerabend's is niche, because Popper is way more ideologically consistent with the culture of modern science. Not to claim causality, of course, I'm just noticing some interesting alignments. Harmonies, if you will. Let me ground what I mean in my area of expertise. Education. So the idea of falsification as a means to generate knowledge aligns remarkably well with the mainstream ethos of teaching science. And I don't mean that professors are teaching students about falsification as an idea. I mean they're teaching students by intellectually hazing them. Think things like professors designing intentionally difficult weed-out classes, or creating unnecessarily competitive research environments, or just generally being a dick to students who dare ask for help because they sincerely think tough love is effective pedagogy. And don't even get me started on the gross sense of pride some faculty have about their program's high failure rates. As if that's some testament to their academic rigor and not evidence of their failure as educators. There's this strong cultural belief in physics that some have it and some don't, which, in a Popperian framework, implies the role of the educator is to identify and elevate the pre-existing geniuses by putting students through as much difficulty as possible and abandoning the ones that struggle. It's applying critical rationalism to people, trying to falsify their ability rather than nurturing it. So when extended to the process of training new scientists, Popper's philosophy rationalizes practices that gatekeep who becomes a scientist and who doesn't, in ways that are driven far more by social forces than rational ones. Another boundary critical rationalism offers philosophical justification for is demarcation, or the difference between science and not science. This is a line that has been debated for millennia, and Popper solves it with the criteria of falsifiability. If the closest we can get to proving something is to try to falsify it and fail, then scientific inquiry is only concerned with things that can be falsified. So if you can't devise a test that could theoretically prove something wrong, you can't do the scientific method on it, it's not science. Contrast this with Feyerabend, who just straight up doesn't believe in demarcation as a useful concept, and insists that the wrong theories that one would use in the process of counterinduction can come from literally anywhere.
The alternative theories, which he needs to keep the contest going, may be taken from the past as well. As a matter of fact, they may be taken from wherever one is able to find them, from ancient myths and modern prejudices, from the lucubrations of experts and from the fantasies of cranks. The whole history of a subject is utilized in the attempt to improve its most recent and most advanced stage. The separation between the history of a science, its philosophy, and the science itself dissolves into thin air, and so does the separation between science and non-science.
There are so many great examples of unscientific knowledge systems not only providing valuable information, but also illuminating some shortcomings of scientific approaches in their respective domains. A great one is the practice of controlled burning, in which indigenous communities across North America would use low-intensity fires to manage land, not as outsiders taming an ecosystem, but as participants in it. But colonial governments, following a Western model that saw nature as separate, static, and best preserved through non-interference, banned the practice, leading to decades of worse wildfires before they realized that the putatively unscientific approach was actually more effective. So for Feyerabend, the fact that unscientific knowledge can be used to sharpen scientific knowledge means there's no reason to demarcate the two to begin with. Knowledge is knowledge. Looking back at Popper, the initially practical seeming criteria of falsifiability now feels overly restrictive. Gatekeeping what knowledge can and can't be brought into the process of science only limits us. But like the gatekeeping of potentially great scientists on bullshit survival of the fittest criteria, it serves a purpose to power. The line between science and not science defines a binary. And as soon as humans define a binary, a hierarchy is born. Because people don't think in terms of science and not science, but still potentially useful for growing knowledge, people think in terms of science you can prove and bullshit that you can't. Which is silly, because even for Popper, you really can't prove anything. But even so, questioning the line that defines this hierarchy can easily be shut down with appeals to the uniquely undeniable robustness of critical rationalism. So in conclusion, the myth of the singular scientific method isn't just inaccurate, it's ideological. It reflects and reinforces a hierarchy of knowledge, where science, as defined by Western academic institutions and done by the special few allowed within their ivory towers, is treated as uniquely legitimate, and everything else is dismissed as superstition or pseudoscience. To be clear, I'm not saying Popper's philosophy causes societal harm, and I don't think it's inherently exclusionary either, but it is really good at drawing clear boundaries and perpetuating itself as the singularly reliable. And I think that's why the myth of the scientific method persists. Not because it's the best or only way to generate knowledge, but because it's ideologically useful. It gives science an unassailable authority while keeping out anything or anyone that might challenge the existing order. So for both science and society, our baby understanding of how science works is limiting, And if we want either to progress, we must concede to Feyerabend. Anything goes. So here's the counter-argument I anticipate to Feyerabend's hippy-dippy, all-knowledge counts approach to science. Yes, boundaries can be abused, and that's bad. But science needs strong boundaries to maintain its authority. If scientific knowledge is going to contribute to the public good, then the public needs to believe it. And if we want people to believe it, we need them to trust that our methods and processes are rigorous and reliable. Otherwise, flat Earth. Now, usually when I preempt a counter-argument to something that I'm saying, it's because I can guess what someone who thinks differently than me might say. But in this case, this is my own internal debate. Like, I am sincerely picking up what Feyerabend's putting down. I see the value in his philosophy so clearly. But at the same time, there were so many moments reading against method where I was just like, yes, flat Earth. To that end, what follows is the result of me being genuinely curious about how to reconcile this. First, I asked myself, how would we know when we should abandon the scientific method for other methods of inquiry? To put this in terms of another science philosopher, Thomas Kuhn proposed that science moves between cycles of normal science and revolutionary science, where the former refines existing paradigms and the latter replaces them with new ones. I wanted to say, well, critical rationalism maps onto normal science very nicely, and counterinduction seems like the kind of method that brings about paradigm shifts. But I think the point at which the shift needs to happen can only really be identified in hindsight, so the option of counterinduction always kind of has to be available. Then I thought, well, maybe it's a utility argument. The assumption of a round Earth is more useful in countless contexts, so the lack of utility is what discredits flat Earth. But again, Galileo's story shows us how this can also be a premature appeal to hindsight. Eventually I started to think this is kind of just a feature of Feyerabend's anything goes, like maybe you can't apply a method to the philosophical rejection of method. I've been going around and around with this, and I really haven't been able to come up with any real-time way of dismissing anti-scientific movements like flat Earth without relying on a hard line between scientifically validated knowledge and pseudoscientific nonsense. But there was a conceptual wall I kept circling back to every time I tried to entertain this question of, in an imagined world where culture and institutions adopt Feyerabend's epistemological pluralism, how would we avoid the problem of flat earthers? And that is, flat earthers are already a problem! Like, why should the burden of proof be on Feyerabend to protect science's authority, when the existing mode of science with Popper as the philosophical default already lacks public trust on the scale that it does? So rather than try to figure out how epistemological pluralism could possibly contend with a threat to scientific authority like flat earthers, let's proceed in a somewhat counter-inductive way and wonder how the current scientific milieu might have produced it. Conveniently, I found a paper written by 3 professors of science education from Brazil that examines the way flat earthers talk about their beliefs on social media, specifically through the lens of Feyerabend's work. Using flat earth content as data, they argue that the movement is best understood not as a simple rejection of particular scientific beliefs, but as a reaction to the rigid, exclusionary way science presents itself in society, what Feyerabend would call scientific dogmatism. And according to them, it's this perceived dogmatism in science that inspires mistrust in it. The segregation of rival discourses is what gives scope to the establishment of science in society. In confrontation with this, possibly due to a reaction to this segregation, the generalized mistrust in relation to science can be considered the condition for the establishment of conspiracy discourses, such as that of the flat Earth. You can check out the paper to read more, but the point is, it is exactly the maintenance of scientific authority through unquestionable boundaries that drives people to adopt flat eartherism as a means to reject it. Which makes a lot of sense. Conspiratorial thinking in general relies heavily on a free-thinking us to contrast with an authoritative and exclusive them. That, us versus them, maps on really well to the us versus them that falls out of a strict Popperian demarcation between science and non-science, especially when you add on the notoriously exclusive gatekeeping of scientific institutions. And also, like with other conspiracy theories, flat Earth isn't just about flat Earth. It's usually believed along with other anti-science claims that individually seem just as incoherent, but collectively have a coherent logic of rejecting truth as presented by the compromised scientific establishment. And while I don't think they're right about the shape of the Earth, I can't say that they don't kind of have a point. Galileo's story shows us that science has always been messier than scientists let on. And when the gaps between that real messiness and the pristine facade that science is often presented with become visible, it makes a lot of sense to ask questions. And while I do think there are satisfying answers to those questions that don't necessitate undermining scientific expertise, unfortunately, believe science isn't one of them. So ironically, the Popperian ideal of demarcation, when wielded to safeguard scientific legitimacy, ends up solidifying the very us versus them binary that groups like flat earthers traffic in. And the stricter and more self-righteous the boundaries of science become, the more attractive it becomes to stand outside them. Another thing worth pointing out here is that once we have movements like flat earth, traditionally scientific approaches don't really offer a way to diffuse the problem. Purely rational methods of scientific argumentation just aren't adequate for combating incorrect scientific beliefs that are ultimately more about power than astronomy. Like, it'd be one thing if people who are interested in the shape of the Earth were also engaged in other related topics of alternative revolutionary scientific study, but as Dan Olson showed in his excellent Flat Earth video, the whole thing functioned basically as a pipeline to QAnon. And I think it's generally true that anti-scientific movements have political functions. Vaccine hesitancy isn't about medicine or virology, it's about bodily autonomy and the freedom to make parenting decisions. Climate denialism isn't about atmospheric science or ecology, it's about protecting financial interests or preserving a worldview in which only God can change the Earth so drastically. So given that the origins of anti-scientific movements are about politics and power rather than scientific inquiry, I think it's unlikely that doubling down on facts and reason will make the problem go away, because you can't science someone out of a belief they weren't scienced into in the first place. It reminds me of this conversation I had with a moon landing truther who wasn't persuaded by the hour of technical arguments I, a literal astrophysicist at the time, laid out for him as to why it did in fact happen. But he immediately reconsidered his whole stance when I offhandedly asked, do you really think that the Russians would have let the US get away with faking this big a win in the space race for all these years? That's all it actually took. Sometimes, convincing people that science is real requires stepping outside of the arguments science can provide, at least depending on your definition of science. I guess Feyerabend might make the case that since the irrational forms of persuasion Galileo used were necessary to advance heliocentrism, unscientific communication can count as doing science. So in addition to potentially avoiding the problem of flat eartherism taking hold to begin with, Feyerabend's pluralism provides a more tractable way to engage with its believers. I guess protecting science's authority might be less about arbitrarily insisting that science is super special, and more about understanding its limitations, and why some feel shut out by it. So I've spent a lot of this video's runtime explaining to you all the things Galileo didn't do, but I want to finish it off by stepping back and asking as holistically as possible, what exactly did he do? We associate him with the Copernican revolution, sure, but what exactly was Galileo's contribution to that lineage? He didn't come up with the initial idea, he didn't develop a coherent physics for it, and he didn't provide compelling evidence for it. So if he wasn't the ideas guy, the math guy, or the evidence guy, I guess you could say he was the hype man. I mean, Feyerabend's whole point with this case study is showing that Galileo's key role was abandoning the scientific method because he just really had a good feeling about this one, guys. No coherent theory, no strong data, just a bunch of interesting overlaps between disparate bits of wrong knowledge, inspiring him to make lots of unrigorous and unscientific arguments. So ironically, the essential thing that Galileo Galilei, revolutionary scientist persecuted by the church, contributed to the Copernican revolution was faith. Wait, is she really pitching faith as the moral of this science talk? I know, it sounds like a stretch, but just hear me out. Faith is an interesting concept as a scientist, because choosing to believe something you can't prove feels antithetical to our whole thing. And there's definitely something comforting in a standard where every belief needs to be justified and every claim backed by data. But Galileo didn't have that, and neither, frankly, do most scientists at the edges of discovery. It's easy to think his story is a historical fluke, that Galileo just got lucky or something. But Feyerabend's point is that this kind of intuition-driven, unmethodical work isn't the exception, it's how science often moves forward, especially during its moments of revolution, not by strict adherence to rules, but through irrational sparks that only after the fact get smoothed into a story of logic. And if you take that spark out of science, you get something cold and dead and rigid, claiming to be objective, but only working to reproduce its own stubborn dogma. Reality is not orderly, it's uncertain. And science doesn't remove that uncertainty so much as build through it, feeling its way forward in infinite darkness with tools that are always gonna be a little imperfect. And the older I get, the more I find myself okay with that, not just as a physicist, but as a human. As a very science-pilled young person, I used to be very averse to the concept of faith in the sense of believing anything that hasn't been rigorously proven. I was your typical physics bro, just super committed to thinking about everything as particles, all the time, always. Looking back, I think I personally held on to that way of thinking because being good at physics and math and stuff was very intellectually validating. So projecting those modes of thinking into other contexts was like a way of asserting my own legitimacy when confronted with things I didn't have better tools to understand. But over time, and with exposure to other such tools, I couldn't get around the fact that blocking myself off to ideas that I can't rationally justify 100% didn't seem to serve me. I don't believe in astrology per se, but I do see the utility. That was half joke and half sincere take that you'll have to wait for a future video to hear, so subscribe and hit the bell. But when I say faith, I'm not just talking about the woo-woo or religiosity even. I mean having faith in things you can't yet be certain about, generally. Things like the possibility of building a life you're excited to live when you haven't yet experienced that. Or the possibility of a better future for humanity that we can somehow still salvage from our current existential crises. It's easy to rationalize pessimism, and the comfort of confidence is nice. But learning to sometimes step away from the cynical certainty and into the more irrational space of unsubstantiated hope has legitimately helped me cope mentally and emotionally with things. And learning all this stuff about Galileo, I noticed that coming to understand his irrational motivations and methods that still drove science forward kind of softened the physics bro part of me that still tries to reject any kind of unprovable faith. And at a time where there are so many very rational reasons to feel a whole lot of despair, when it sometimes feels like despair is the point and resisting it is a critical political act, I get a weirdly logical solace from the fact that Galileo's faithful commitment to what he irrationally believed in brought the reality he imagined into existence. So I guess the moral of the story is, in science like in life, faith is good actually.
Anybody feels like perspiring, I'd invite you to go ahead because I'm sure going to. In fact, I'm going to Greetings, thanks, and congratulations to Kenyon's graduating class of 2005. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish. The point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. Stated as an English sentence, of course, this is just a banal platitude. But the fact is that in the day-to-day trenches of adult existence, banal platitudes can have a life or death importance. Or so I wish to suggest to you on this dry and lovely morning. Of course, the main requirement of speeches like this is that I'm supposed to talk about your liberal arts education's meaning, to try to explain why the degree you're about to receive has actual human value instead of just a material payoff. So let's talk about the single most pervasive cliche in the commencement speech genre, which is that a liberal arts education is not so much about filling you up with knowledge as it is about, quote, teaching you how to think. If you're like me as a student, you've never liked hearing this, and you tend to feel a bit insulted by the claim that you've needed anybody to teach you how to think, since the fact that you even got admitted to a college this good seems like proof that you already know how to think. But I'm going to posit to you that the liberal arts cliche turns out not to be insulting at all, because the really significant education in thinking that we're supposed to get in a place like this isn't really about the capacity to think, but rather about the choice of what to think about. If your total freedom of choice regarding what to think about seems too obvious to waste time discussing, I'd ask you to think about fish and water and to bracket for just a few minutes your skepticism about the value of the totally obvious. Here's another didactic little story. There are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other's an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from camp in that terrible blizzard, and I was totally lost, and I couldn't see a thing, and it was 50 below. And so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and cried out, oh God, if there is a God, I'm lost in this blizzard and I'm going to die if you don't help me. And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks at the atheist all puzzled. Well, then you must believe now, he says. After all, here you are, alive. The atheist just rolls his eyes. No, man, all that was a couple Eskimos happened to come wandering by and they showed me the way back to camp. It's easy to run this story through a kind of standard liberal arts analysis. The exact same experience can mean two totally different things to two different people, given those people's two different belief templates and two different ways of constructing meaning from experience. Because we prize tolerance and diversity of belief, nowhere in our liberal arts analysis do we want to claim that one guy's interpretation is true and the other guy's is false or bad. Which is fine, except we also never end up talking about just where these individual templates and beliefs come from, meaning where they come from inside the two guys. As if a person's most basic orientation toward the world and the meaning of his experience were somehow just hardwired, like height or shoe size, or automatically absorbed from the culture, like language. As if how we construct meaning were not actually a matter of personal, intentional choice. Plus there's the matter of arrogance. The non-religious guy is so totally certain in his dismissal of the possibility that the passing Eskimos had anything to do with his prayer for help. True, there are plenty of religious people who seem arrogantly certain of their own interpretations too. They're probably even more repulsive than atheists, at least to most of us. But religious dogmatist problem is exactly the same as the story's unbeliever: blind certainty. A closed-mindedness that amounts to an imprisonment so total that the prisoner doesn't even know he's locked up. The point here is that I think this is one part of what teaching me how to think is really supposed to mean: to be just a little less arrogant, to have just a little critical awareness about myself and my certainties, because a huge percentage of stuff that I tend to be automatically certain of is, it turns out, totally wrong and deluded. I have learned this the hard way, as I predict you graduates will too. Here is just one example of the total wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe.
the realest, most vivid and important person in existence. We rarely talk about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive, but it's pretty much the same for all of us. It is our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. Think about it. There is no experience you have had that you are not at the absolute center of. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV or your monitor, and so on. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, real. Please don't worry that I'm getting ready to lecture you about compassion or other directedness or all the so-called virtues. This is not a matter of virtue. It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural, hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered, and to see and interpret everything through this lens of self. People who can adjust their natural default setting this way are often described as being well-adjusted, which I suggest to you is not an accidental term. Given the triumphant academic setting here, an obvious question is how much of this work of adjusting our default setting involves actual knowledge or intellect. This question gets very tricky. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, at least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to over-intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract arguments inside my head instead of simply paying attention to what's going on right in front of me, paying attention to what is going on inside me. As I'm sure you guys know by now, it is extremely difficult to stay alert and attentive instead of getting hypnotized by the constant monologue inside your own head. Maybe happening right now. 20 years after my own graduation, I have come gradually to understand that the liberal arts cliche about teaching you how to think is actually shorthand for a much deeper, more serious idea. Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally posed. Think of the old cliche about, quote, the mind being an excellent servant but a terrible master. This, like many cliches, so lame and unexciting on the surface, actually expresses a great and terrible truth. It is not the least bit coincidental that adults who commit suicide with firearms almost always shoot themselves in the head. They shoot the terrible master. And the truth is that most of these suicides are actually dead long before they pull the trigger. And I submit that this is what the real, no bullshit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, imperially alone, day in and day out. That may sound like hyperbole or abstract nonsense. Let's get concrete. The plain fact is that you graduating seniors do not yet have any clue what day in, day out really means. There happen to be whole, large parts of adult American life that nobody talks about in commencement speeches. One such part involves boredom, routine, and petty frustration. The parents and older folks here will know all too well what I'm talking about. By way of example, let's say it's an average adult day and you get up in the morning, go to your challenging white-collar college graduate job, and you work hard for 8 or 10 hours, and at the end of the day you're tired and somewhat stressed, and all you want is to go home and have a good supper and maybe unwind for an hour and then hit the sack early, because of course you have to get up the next day and do it all again. But then you remember there's no food at home. You haven't had time to shop this week because of your challenging job. And so now, after work, you have to get in your car and drive to the supermarket. It's the end of a work day, and the traffic is apt to be very bad. So getting to the store takes way longer than it should. And when you finally get there, the supermarket is very crowded, because of course it's the time of day when all the other people with jobs also try to squeeze in some grocery shopping. And the store is hideously fluorescently lit and infused with soul-killing Muzak or corporate pop. And it's pretty much the last place you want to be. But you can't just get in and quickly out. You have to wander all over the huge, overlit store's confusing aisles to find the stuff you want. And you have to maneuver your junky cart through all these other tired, hurried people with carts, et cetera, cutting stuff out because it's a long ceremony. And eventually, you get all your supper supplies, except now it turns out there aren't enough checkout lanes open, even though it's the end of the day rush. So the checkout line is incredibly long, which is stupid and infuriating. But you can't take your frustration out on the frantic lady working the register, who is overworked at a job whose daily tedium and meaninglessness surpasses the imagination of any of us here at a prestigious college. But anyway, you finally get to the checkout line's front, and you pay for your food and get told to have a nice day in a voice that is the absolute voice of death. And then you have to take your creepy, flimsy plastic bags of groceries in your cart with the one crazy wheel that pulls maddeningly to the left, all the way out through the crowded, bumpy, littery parking lot. And then you have to drive all the way home through slow, heavy, SUV-intensive rush hour traffic, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone here has done this, of course, but it hasn't yet been part of you graduates' actual life routine, day after week, after month, after year. But it will be. And many more dreary, annoying, seemingly meaningless routines besides. But that is not the point. The point is that petty, frustrating crap like this is exactly where the work of choosing is going to come in. Because the traffic jams and crowded aisles and long checkout lines give me time to think. And if I don't make a conscious decision about how to think and what to pay attention to, I'm going to be pissed and miserable every time I have to shop. Because my natural default setting is the certainty that situations like this are really all about me. About my hungriness and my fatigue and my desire to just get home. And it's going to seem for all the world like everybody else is just in my way. And who are all these people in my way? And look at how repulsive most of them are and how stupid and cow-like and dead-eyed and non-human they seem in the checkout line. Or at how annoying and rude it is that people are talking loudly on cell phones in the middle of the line. And look at how deeply, personally unfair this is. Or, of course, if I'm in a more socially conscious liberal arts form of my default setting, I can spend time in the end-of-the-day traffic being disgusted about all the huge, stupid, lane-blocking SUVs and Hummers and V12 pickup trucks burning their wasteful, selfish 40-gallon tanks of gas. And I can dwell on the fact that the patriotic or religious bumper stickers always seem to be on the biggest, most disgustingly selfish vehicles, driven by the ugliest, this is an example of how not to think. Biggest, most disgustingly selfish vehicles driven by the ugliest, most inconsiderate and aggressive drivers. And I can think about how our children's children will despise us for wasting all the future's fuel and probably screwing up the climate, and how spoiled and stupid and selfish and disgusting we all are, and how modern consumer society just sucks, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. If I choose to think this way in the store and on the freeway, fine. Lots of us do. Except thinking this way tends to be so easy and automatic that it doesn't have to be a choice. It is my natural default setting. It's the automatic way that I experience the boring, frustrating, crowded parts of adult life when I'm operating on the automatic, unconscious belief that I am the center of the world and that my immediate needs and feelings are what should determine the world's priority. The thing is that, of course, there are totally different ways to think about these kinds of situations. In this traffic, all these vehicles stuck and idling in my way, it's not impossible that some of these people in SUVs have been in horrible auto accidents in the past and now find driving so terrifying that their therapist has all but ordered them to get a huge, heavy SUV so they can feel safe enough to drive. Or that the Hummer that just cut me off is maybe being driven by a father whose little child is hurt or sick in the seat next to him, and he's trying to get this kid to the hospital, and he's in a way bigger, more legitimate hurry than I am. It is actually I who am in his way. Or I can choose to force myself to consider the likelihood that everyone else in the supermarket's checkout line is just as bored and frustrated as I am, and that some of these people probably have much harder, more tedious or painful lives than I do. Again, please don't think I'm giving you moral advice, or that I'm saying you're supposed to think this way, or that anyone expects you to just automatically do it, because it's hard. It takes will and effort. And if you are like me, some days you won't be able to do it, or you just flat out won't want to. But most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of her husband who's dying of bone cancer. Or maybe this very lady is the low-wage clerk at the motor vehicles department who just yesterday helped your spouse resolve a horrific, infuriating red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it's also not impossible. It just depends what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure that you know what reality is and who and what is really important, if you want to operate on your default setting, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that aren't annoying and miserable. But if you really learned how to think, how to pay attention, then you will know you have other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell-type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that lit the stars. Love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. Not that that mystical stuff's necessarily true. The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try to see it. This, I submit, is the freedom of real education, of learning how to be well-adjusted. You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. You get to decide what to worship. Because here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And a compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally point. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. Look, the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it is that they are unconscious. They are default settings. They're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the so-called real world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings, because the so-called real world of men and money and power comes merrily along on the fuel of fear and anger and frustration and craving and the worship of self. Our own present culture has harnessed these forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and personal freedom. The freedom all to be lords of our own tiny skull-sized kingdom, alone at the center of all creation. This kind of freedom has much to recommend it. But of course there are all different kinds of freedom, and the kind that is most precious you will not hear much talked about much in the great outside world of wanting and achieving and displaying. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty little unsexy ways every day. That is real freedom. That is being educated and understanding how to think. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth with a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish. But please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out. Which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck.
What do you read, my lord?
Words. Words. Words.
What is the matter, my lord?
Between who?
I mean the matter that you read, my lord.
Slanders, sir, for the satirical rogue says here that old men have grey hair, their faces are wrinkled, their eyes purging thick amber and Plumtree gum, and that they have a plentiful lack of wit, together with most weak hams. Oh, which, sir, though I most powerfully and potently believe, yet I hold it not honesty to have it thus set down, for yourself, sir, could be as old as I am, if, like a crab, you could go backwards.
Though this be madness, yet there's method in it. Will you walk out of the air, my lord?
Into my grave?
Indeed, that is out of the air. How pregnant sometimes his replies are. I'll leave him now and contrive the means of meeting between him and my daughter. My honourable lord, I will most humbly take my leave of you.
You cannot, sir, take from me anything I will more willingly part withal. Except my life. Except my life. Except
my life. Farewell, my lord.
These tedious old fools.
You go to seek the Lord Hamlet. There he is.
God save you, sir.
My honoured lord.
My excellent good friends! How dost thou, Guildenstern? Rosencrantz! I'm very glad to see you. How do you both?
Yes, indifferent children of the earth.
We're happy in that we're not over happy. On Fortune's cap, we're not the very button.
Nor the soles of her shoe.
Neither, my lord.
Then you live about her waist or in the middle of her favours?
Face? Private, sweet.
Ooh, in the secret parts of Fortune. 'Tis most true. She is a strumpet. What's the news?
None, my lord, but that. The world's grown honest.
Then is doomsday near, for your news is not true. But let me question more in particular. What have you, my good friends, deserved at the hands of Fortune that she sends you to prison hither?
Prison, my lord?
Denmark's a prison.
Then is the world one?
A goodly one, in which there are many wards, confines, dungeons, Denmark being one of the worst.
We think not so, my lord.
Why then, 'tis none to you. For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. To me, it is a prison.
Why then your ambition makes it one. 'Tis too narrow for your mind.
Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams.
There is a point of so-called Christian, not only Christian wisdom, to which I'm totally opposed. I'm generally opposed to wisdom. I think wisdom is the most disgusting thing you can imagine. Wisdom is the most conformist thing you can imagine. Wisdom is this, you know, whatever you do, a wise man will come and justify it, you know. Like, you do something risky and you succeed. There will be a wise man who will come and say something like, I don't know, we in Slovene, we have a proverb, maybe you have a similar one, only those who risk profit, and so on and so on. Let's say you do the same thing but fail. A wise man will come and he will say something like, in Slovene we had a vulgar saying which says you cannot urinate against the wind or something like that. You know, this is wisdom. Whatever you do, a wise guy will come and wisdom, you know.
But it's so interesting that a philosopher should be against wisdom.
We all are. I mean, your Kierkegaard knew this. Kierkegaard was anti-wise man par excellence. Wisdom is pagan. Not going to my Stalinist stuff. But what I want to do, once I made a mental experiment, if you don't believe me. Let's take, I will say something. I will say, I don't know how to say it, I'm too ironic with all this pathos, you know. Why are we running after these miserable earthly pleasures? Think about eternity. The only satisfaction is eternity. If I were to say it with proper pathos, it would sound a deep thing to say.
It sounded...
Now, let's say the opposite. Why run after the specter of eternity? Carpe diem. Grasp what you have here. It sounds wise. Now I will say the third option. Why be caught in a contrast between eternity and temporary existence? The true wisdom is to see eternity in fleeting temporary pleasures. It is wise. Then I say the fourth variation. We are forever condemned between the two. A wise man accepts this. No, whatever I say, that's my point. You can sell it as a wisdom. This is a wisdom. And if from no one else, from your Kierkegaard, you can learn this, that whatever Jesus Christ was, he wasn't a wise guy.
What's a suzerain? A keeper or overlord. Why not say keeper then? Because he is a special kind of keeper. A suzerain rules even where there are other rulers. His authority countermands local judgments.
an unfinished country. It's still prehistorical. The only thing that is lacking is the dinosaurs here. It's like a curse weighing on an entire landscape. And whoever goes too deep into this has his share of that curse. So we are cursed with what we are doing here. It's a land that God, if he exists, has created in anger. It's the only land where creation is unfinished yet. Taking a close look at what's around us, there is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder. And we, in comparison to the articulate vileness and baseness and obscenity of all this jungle, we, in comparison to that enormous articulation, we only sound and look like badly pronounced and half-finished sentences out of a stupid suburban novel, a cheap novel. And we have to become humble in front of this overwhelming misery and overwhelming fornication, overwhelming growth, and overwhelming lack of order. Even the stars up here in the sky look like a mess. There is no harmony in the universe. We have to get acquainted to this idea that there is no real harmony as we have conceived it. But when I say this all full of admiration for the jungle. It is not that I hate it. I love it. I love it very much. But I love it against my better judgment.
A lot of this is going to get cut out, right?
Perhaps. But I'll make the decision as to what's cut out.
It's funny. I'm totally intimidated. I'm sitting next to the guy in the green room and, not saying a word. Then the minute he leaves, I start haranguing his publicist. The thing that interested me about
Yes.
Shine was I thought, besides being a manual for how to build a mentally ill child, all the early adult stuff, I thought it was absolutely incredible up until the end. And then I just thought, the causes of the dysfunction and the symptoms of the dysfunction are unpacked with such complexity and such care. And the ending, charming though Lynn Redgrave is, just the move from the time he becomes a hit in the bar to the time Lynn Redgrave meets him to the time she consults an astrology chart to marry him to his very moving Mr. Holland's Opus-like performance at the end. It's terrific, but it happens at about 10 times the speed that all the other stuff did. So the thing I was asking the publicist is, did the money guys or the studio guys make him rap the ending?
And they said no.
They got a little
bristly.
And I am not trying to bust on Shine. Which
I know you're not. But what we're trying to do here is just understand you by talking about things other than your work. And we'll come back to the work.
Unfortunately, most of the things that are leaving my mouth seem to be mean.
What?
Most of the things that are leaving my mouth seem to be mean.
Well, we'll get to that. Okay.